Bird Lore, 6 Poems by Rose Fyleman. Coffee Break Collection number 35, Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by KellyWilcoxBaird. Bird Lore, 6 Poems by Rose Fyleman. Peacocks. Peacocks sweep the fairies' rooms. They use their folded tails for brooms. But fairy dust is brighter far than any mortal colors are, and all about their tails it clings in strange designs of rounds and rings, and that is why they strut about and proudly spread their feathers out. The cuckoo. The cuckoo is a telltale, a mischief-making bird. He flies to east, he flies to west, and whispers into every nest the wicked things he's heard. He loves to spread his naughty lies, he laughs about it as he flies. Cuckoo, he cries, cuckoo, cuckoo, it's true, it's true. And when the fairies catch him, his busy wings they dock. They shut him up for evermore. He may not go beyond the door inside a wooden clock. Inside a wooden clock he cowers and has to tell the proper hours. Cuckoo, he cries, cuckoo, cuckoo, it's true, it's true. The rooks. High in the elm trees sit the rooks, or flit about with busy looks and solemn, ceaseless caws. Small wonder they are so intent, they are the fairies' parliament. They make the fairy laws. They never seem to stop all day, and you can hear from far away their busy chatter-chat. They work so very hard indeed, you'd wonder that the fairies need so many laws as that. The robin. The robin is the fairies' page. They keep him neatly dressed for country service or for town in dapper livery of brown and little scarlet vest. On busy errands all day long he hurries to and fro with watchful eyes and nimble wings. They are not very many things the robin doesn't know. And he can tell you, if he will, the latest fairy news, the quaint adventures of the king, and whom the queen is visiting, and where she gets her shoes. And lately, when the fairy court invited me to tea, he stood behind the royal chair, and here I solemnly declare, when he discovered I was there, that robin winked at me. The cock. The kindly cock is the fairies' friend. He warns them when their revels must end. He never forgets to give the word, for the cock is a thoroughly punctual bird. And since he grieves that he never can fly, like all the other birds up in the sky, the fairies put him now and again high on a church for a weather vane. Little for sun or for rain he cares. He turns about with the proudest airs, and chuckles with joy as the clouds go past, to think he is up in the sky at last. The grouse. The grouse that lives on the moorland wide is filled with a most ridiculous pride. He thinks that it all belongs to him, and everyone else must obey his whim. When the queer wee folk who live in the moors come joyfully leaping out of their doors to frisk about on the warm, sweet heather, laughing and chattering all together, he looks askance at their rollicking play and calls to them in the angriest way, "You're a feather-brained, foolish, frivolous pack. Go back, you rascally imps, go back." But little enough they heed his shout. Over the rocks they tumble about. They chase each other over the ling. They kick their heels in the heather and sing, "Oh-ho, Mr. Grouse, you'd best beware, or some fine day, if you don't take care, the witch who lives in the big brown bog with a wise old weasel, a rat, and a frog, will come a-capering over the fell and put you under a horrible spell. Your feathers will molt, and your voice will crack. Go back, you silly old bird, go back." End of Bird Lore, 6 Poems by Rose Fyleman.
A Bird's Free Lunch by John Burroughs. Coffee Break Collection 35, Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Bird's Free Lunch. One winter, during 4 or 5 weeks of severe weather, several of our winter birds were pensioners upon my bounty. 3 blue jays, 2 downy woodpeckers, 3 chickadees, and 1 kinglet, and later a snowbird, junco. appeared. I fastened pieces of suet and marrow bones upon the tree in front of my window. Then, as I sat at my desk, watched the birds at their free lunch. The jays bossed the woodpeckers. The woodpeckers bossed the chickadees, and the chickadees bossed the kinglet. Sometimes, in my absence, a crow would swoop down and boss the whole crew and carry off the meat. The kinglet was the least of all, a sort of hop-o'-my-thumb bird. He became quite tame, and one day alighted upon my arm as I stood leaning against the tree. I could have put my hand upon him several times. I wonder where the midget roosted. He was all alone. He liked the fare so well that he seemed disposed to stop till spring. During one terrible night of wind and snow and 0 temperature, I feared he would be swept away. I thought of him in the middle of the night, when the violence of the storm kept me from sleep. Imagine this solitary atom in feathers drifting about in the great Arctic out of doors and managing to survive. I fancied him in one of my thick spruces, his head under his tiny wing, buffeted by the wind and snow, his little black feet clinging to the perch and wishing that morning would come. The fat meat is fuel for him. It keeps up the supply of animal heat. None of the birds will eat lean meat. They want the clear fat. The jays alight upon it and peck away with great vigor, almost standing on tiptoe to get the proper sweep. The woodpecker uses his head alone in pecking, but the jay's action involves the whole body. Yet his blows are softer, not so sharp and abrupt as those of the woodpecker. Pecking is not exactly his business. He swallows the morsel eagerly, watching all the time, lest some enemy surprise him in the act. Indeed, one noticeable thing about all the birds is their nervousness while eating. The chickadee turns that bead-like eye of his in all directions incessantly, lest something seize him while he is not looking. He is not off his guard for a moment. It is almost painful to observe the state of fear in which he lives. He will not keep his place upon the bone longer than a few seconds at a time, lest he become a mark for some enemy, a hawk, a shrike, or a cat. One would not think the food would digest when taken in such haste and trepidation. While the jays are feeding, swallowing morsel after morsel very rapidly, the chickadees flit about in an anxious, peevish manner, lest there be none left for themselves. I suspect the jays carry the food off and hide it, as they certainly do corn when I put it out for the hens. The jay has a capacious throat. He will lodge half a dozen or more kernels of corn in it, stretching his neck up as he takes them to give them room, and then fly away to an old bird's nest or a caterpillar's nest and deposit them in it. But in this respect, the little kettle cannot call the big pot black. The chickadee also will carry away what it cannot eat. One day I dug a dozen or more white grubs, the larvae of some beetle, out of a decayed maple on my woodpile and placed them upon my windowsill. The chickadees soon discovered them and fell to carrying them off as fast as ever they could, distributing them among the branches of the Norway spruces. Among the grubs was one large white one, half the size of one's little finger. One of the chickadees seized this. It was all he could carry, but he made off with it. The mate to this grub I found rolled up in a smooth cell in a mass of decayed wood in the heart of the old maple referred to. It was full of frost. I carried it in by the fire, and the next day it was alive and apparently wanted to know what had brought spring so suddenly. How rapidly birds live! Their demand for food is almost incessant. This colony of mine appear to feed every 8 or 10 minutes. Their little mills grind their grist very rapidly. Once in my walk upon the sea beach I encountered 2 small beach birds running up and down in the edge of the surf, keeping just in the thin lace-like edging of the waves, and feeding upon the white, cricket-like hoppers that quickly buried themselves in the sand as the waters retreated. I kept company with the birds till they ceased to be afraid of me. They would feed eagerly for a few minutes, and then stop, stand on one leg, and put their heads under their wings for 2 or 3 minutes, and then resume their feeding. So rapidly did they digest their food. But all birds digest very rapidly. My 2 woodpeckers seldom leave the tree upon which the food is placed. One is a male, as is shown by his red plume, and the other a female. There is not a bit of kindness or amity between them. Indeed, there is open hostility. The male will not allow the female even to look at the meat while he is feeding. She will sidle around toward it, edging nearer and nearer, when he will suddenly dart at her and often pursue her till she leaves the tree. Every hour in the day I see him trying to drive her from the neighborhood. She stands in perpetual dread of him and gives way the instant he approaches. He is a tyrant and a bully. They both pass the night in snug chambers which they have excavated in the decayed branch of an old apple tree, but not together. But in the spring what a change will come over the male! He will protest to the female that he was only in fun, that she took him far too seriously, that he had always cherished a liking for her. Last April I saw a male trying his blandishments upon a female in this way. It may have been the same pair I am now observing. The female was extremely shy and reluctant. Evidently she was skeptical of the sincerity of so sudden a change on the part of the male. I saw him pursue her from tree to tree with the most flattering attention. The flight of the woodpecker is at all times undulating, but on such occasions this feature is so enhanced and the whole action so affected and studied on the part of the male that the scene becomes highly amusing. The female flew down upon a low stump in the currant patch and was very busy about her own affairs. The male followed, alighted on something several rods distant, and appeared to be equally busy about his affairs. Presently the female made quite a long flight to a tree by the roadside. I could not tell how the male knew she had flown and what course she had taken, as he was hidden from her amid the thick currant bushes. But he did know, and soon followed after, in his curious, exaggerated, undulatory manner of flight. I have no doubt that his suit was finally successful. I watch these woodpeckers daily to see if I can solve the mystery as to how they hop up and down the trunks and branches without falling away from them when they let go their hold. They come down a limb or trunk backward by a series of little hops, moving both feet together. If the limb is at an angle to the tree, and they are on the under side of it, they do not fall away from it to get a new hold an inch or half-inch farther down. They are held to it as steel to a magnet. Both tail and head are involved in the feat. At the instant of making the hop, the head is thrown in and the tail thrown out, but the exact mechanics of it I cannot penetrate. Philosophers do not yet know how a backward-falling cat turns in the air, but turn she does. It may be that the woodpecker never quite relaxes his hold, though to my eye he appears to do so. Birds nearly always pass the night in such places as they select for their nest. Ground builders upon the ground, tree builders upon trees. I have seen an oriole ensconce himself for the night amid the thick cluster of leaves on the end of a maple branch, where soon after his mate built her nest. My chickadees, true to this rule, pass the Arctic winter nights in little cavities in the trunks of trees, like the woodpeckers. One cold day about 4 o'clock, while it was snowing and blowing, I heard, as I was unharnessing my horse near the old apple tree, the sharp, chiding note of a chickadee. On looking for the bird, I failed to see him. Suspecting the true cause of his sudden disappearance, I took a pole and touched a limb that had an opening in its end where the wrens had the past season had a nest. As I did so, out came the chickadee and scolded sharply. The storm and the cold had driven him early to his chamber. The snow buntings are said to plunge into the snowbanks and pass the night there. We know the ruffed grouse does this. End of A Bird's Free Lunch by John Burroughs.
The Black Republic by Tickner Edwards. Coffee Break Collection 35. Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Black Republic. Under the lee of the elmwood the old farmhouse stands, its latticed windows afire in the rose-red glory of the lifting sun. For many a long day past the north-west gale has thundered in the tree-tops, but now, under cover of the darkness, the chill, unruly wind has gone. March has come in like the proverbial lamb. In pure gold the dim-eyed morning breaks through the trellis of purple cloud, and the voice of the wind in the towering elm grove has given place to the busy clamour of the nesting rooks. Perhaps it is this sudden, well-nigh mysterious, return of the rooks in springtime to their old ancestral breeding place that marks, more than anything else, the progress of the year. Ever since June the rookery has been deserted. Now and again a solitary bird could be seen taking a swift survey, in passing, of the abandoned homesteads, and in November a few of the black wicker cradles were furbished up and stanchioned against the coming winter blasts. But until yesterday, when February went out with its surging tumult of wind, the rookery was given over to the starlings, and the sooty army still kept far afield, searching the new-turned furrows, or making common cause with the jackdaws down on the riverside flats. Then came at last sunset's failing breeze, and a windless gloaming, darkness brimming planet high with a new strange silence, warm wandering airs filling the deepest hour before the dawn. And then, with the first grey tinge of morning, a sudden babel of voices overhead. Daybreak revealed the airy city populous as ever. Each nest, a dark blotch against the paling sky, had its clangorous pair about it. Dusky wings were cleaving the twilight everywhere. The summer life of the rookery had begun, as it nearly always does, with the first still sunny hour of March. If a human parallel may be found in the lives of most wild creatures of the countryside, in nothing is this more evident than in the social life of the rook. It is true, he concerns himself with none of the more picturesque attributes, nor the subtler graces of humankind. For these we must seek elsewhere in the world of feathered things. The skylark has his prototype among musical humanity, in that he loves to sing his pure song in the farthermost skies, but lives his daily life through willingly enough amidst the lowliest clods. The ringing laugh of the woodpecker is blatant human cynicism impersonified. The thrush stands for invincible light-heartedness, the dogged optimism that holds up its brave, foolish face against all adversity's rebuffs. The nightingale is worldly grief's melodious advocate. Every note tells of a cherishing of sorrow and overweening vanity in pain. But the rook contemns all fine foibles and empty, unproductive sentiment. He will have nothing but the obvious verities of life. A grim and colour-fast utilitarianism rules his every act. He has indeed an old and undeserved repute for sociability, in that he often builds his airy castle nigh to human settlements. But this is out of no respect or confidence in the selected neighbour. The rook knows that other and more active enemies of his shun the vicinage of man, and he deliberately makes choice of the lesser evil. Man he trusts not a jot more than any other living thing. He keeps all alike at strategic distance. It is as if he had measured out a gunshot length on every side of his aerial dwelling, and any encroachment within this necromantic circle is followed at once by the whole colony's precipitate flight. And yet, as an understudy of a certain type of human nature, the rook may be said to fulfil the conditions more nearly than any other bird. His main personal characteristic would appear to be a crafty timorousness, discretion brought by heredity almost to the fine point of cowardice. For the rest, as an individual, he seems to be chiefly made up of worldly wisdom, anxious foresight, much love of bodily security, and intellectual selfishness, all developed to a sharp focus through unnumbered generations. For all these qualities influence his daily life, and are at the bottom of his conduct consistently throughout his triple duty to himself, his mate, and his fellows. The marital life of each pair of rooks forms a curious study in domestic compromise. For more than 8 months in the year, the partners lead an indifferent, perhaps an entirely separate existence. And then, with the first calm days of March, comes this annual honeymooning, carefully timed for the heyday of the year. 3 months of domestic joy and care spent high up in the swaying elm tops, when they seem to develop suddenly a whole new sheaf of parental and lover-like attributes. The repair of the old nest or the building of a new one, and its preparation for the coming brood, is an absorbing mutual anxiety. All through this time and the period of incubation following, the rook assiduously feeds his mate. He waits upon her with unwearying attention, and on rare occasions will even take his turn upon the eggs, while she stretches her wings a little, flapping about ponderously in the neighbouring branches, the pair keeping up a running fire of comment on the affairs of the rookery in general, in that rich deep language of which we can only gather the merest inkling now and then. But it is in the corporate life of the rookery that the observer's interest must chiefly centre. The spirit of a medieval stronghold permeates it through and through, linked, nevertheless, with a genuine modern republican feeling. How nice a balance has been struck between individual and collective polity in these black republics of the tree-tops will probably never be fully ascertained. Most lover students of nature are willing to admit the finite quality in all human observation and deduction of this kind. The drawn curtain and the closed door oppose them at every turn of the difficult way. But that system and order, tried and proved through countless ages, are at the base of many apparently unaccountable things in rook government, is at least certain. Watching a colony of rooks, by means of a powerful glass, on any fine still day in early springtime, many curious traits in their communal life are soon revealed. Though a complete general understanding of what is needful for the common good can be at once detected, it is also soon evident that each pair is deeply imbued with an only half-concealed distrust of its fellows. A polite fiction of mutual confidence is indeed maintained by all, but there is an equally obvious determination on the part of each couple never to run the risk of possible dishonesty in its neighbours. The half-built nest is never left unguarded. One of the partners invariably remains on the watch while the other is absent foraging for sticks. Just as there is always a black sheep in every fold, there seems to be in most rookeries one of the swart brotherhood whose blackness goes all the way through. Sometimes, in the midst of the busy cawing and bustle of the day, a sudden hubbub will arise. Round one of the nests a fierce conflict is waging. Half a dozen birds have launched themselves upon it, rending it to fragments, and casting it like chaff to the ground, while others are chasing off the luckless proprietors, following them through the blue air with a sound not wholly unlike that of a pack of hounds in full cry. It is difficult to make sure of the motive for this determined eviction, but in all likelihood a pilferer from other nests has been caught at his work, and destruction of his own home and banishment from the colony is the ordained penalty for the offence. Sometimes a solitary rook may be seen flying from tree-top to tree-top, taking a frantic interest in the work of the others, yet invariably met at all points by rude repulse and buffetings. This is the odd bird in the rookery. A great disgrace is upon him, the disgrace of bachelorhood, and there will be no peace for himself, nor good repute with his neighbours, until by some means or other his matrimonial shortcomings have been made good. At last, in some mysterious way, perhaps by mating with a widow rook from another colony, he gets him a wife, and the new pair settle down to nest building, often in a tree far removed from the rest. An interesting point in all nature study, and never more interesting than when the rook is under debate, is in what degree the songs and call notes of birds constitute a language, a real medium of communication, not only between each songster and his mate, but throughout the general commonwealth of wings. When the rooks are delving in the furrows on land, set about by dense hedgerows, a sentinel is always posted in one of the neighbouring trees, and there is no mistaking the import of the cry by which he warns his people below of the approach of any enemy. "Look out!" The words, shouted lustily across a field, would almost exactly reproduce the loud raucous note that sets the whole company at once in full retreat. And when, flying away from the gun, a long straggling line of rooks stretches by overhead, there is no doubt of the meaning of the quick, harsh, desultory sounds that break from the hurrying throng. Anger, mutual congratulation at escape, a fine disgust at the interruption of their raid on the growing corn, each quality is easily distinguishable in the general chorus. But lying out here in the shelter of the hedgerow on any soft sunny March morning, when your presence is unknown or disregarded, and the busy life of the rookery is going forward without suspicion or alloy, it is not so easy to isolate expression among the thousand varied notes that go to make up the rich laborious cadence overhead. Perhaps there is nothing in nature so supremely soothing and restful as the harmonious uproar of the nesting rooks. March brings with it another sound, the voice from the lambing pens, almost as sweet and as full of the promise of spring. But this has none of the deep forceful murmur of the rookery. It is a plaint, a lamentation. Night and day the pathos of it rends the air, sobering the gladness of the sunshine, and lifting its protest against the bright serenity of the moonlit night. But there is no weak, puling quality in this tree-top music of the rook. Life as he knows it is often hard, often relentlessly cruel, but he takes bitter and sweet with the same egoistic philosophy. When the wind blows with hurricane strength, and in an hour undoes the work of many days, he goes about the task again with a fine imperturbability. Warmth and sunshine, and the lazy clouds creeping over the windless blue, mean for him labour without enthusiasm. And darkness with the rook is but another name for rest and dreamless sleep. While the lambing yard below makes the small hours vociferous with its eternal yammering and calling, the quietest place in the countryside is this populous rook city, set in its garden of elm blossom, and hung midway between earth and the glittering star-strewn night. End of the Black Republic.
Blue Jay from Birds Through an Opera Glass by Florence A. Merriam. Coffee Break Collection 35, Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in March 2023. Blue Jay. The blue jay comes with a dash and a flourish. As Thoreau says, he blows the trumpet of winter. Unlike the chickadee, whose prevailing tints match the winter sky, and whose gentle day-to-day chimes with the softly falling snows, the blue jay would wake the world up. His clarionet peals over the villages, asleep in the snowdrifts, as if it would rouse even the smoke that drowses over their white roofs. He brings the vigor and color of winter. He would send the shivering stay-at-homes jingling merrily over the fields and start the children coasting down the hills. Wake up, come out, he calls, and blows a blast to show what winter is good for. And so he flashes about and screams and scolds till we crawl to the window to look at him. Ha! What a handsome bird! He has found the breakfast hung on the tree for him and clings to it, packing away with the appetite of a Greenlander. Not a hint of winter in his coloring. Note his purplish back as he bends over, the exquisite cobalt blue touched off with black and white on his wings, and the black barring on the tightly closed tail he is bracing himself by. How distinguished his dark necklace and handsome blue crest make him look. There, he is off again, and before we think where he is going, we hear the echo of his rousing fee-fay, fee-fay from the depths of the woods. In many places the jays are common winter residents, pitching their tents with the hens and barnyard animals, and comporting themselves with familiar assurance. But in this region they are irregular guests, Sometimes they are here for a few days in the fall, or visit us when the hawks return in the spring, teasing the young observer by imitating the cry of the red-tailed hawk. But if the fancy takes them, they spend the winter with us, showing comparatively little of the timidity they feel in some localities. Last fall, a party of jays stayed here for some time, but when I was congratulating myself on having them for the winter, they left and did not return till the middle of January. Then one morning one of them appeared suddenly on a tree in front of the window. He seemed to have been there before, for he flew straight down to the corn boxes by the dining room. The gray squirrels had nibbled out the sweetest part of the kernels, and he acted dissatisfied with what was left, dropping several pieces after he had picked them up. But at last he swallowed a few kernels, and then took 3 or 4 in his bill at once, and flew up in a maple. He must have deposited some of them in a crotch at the body of the tree, for after he had broken one in 2 under his claws, striking it with sledge-hammer blows, he went back to the crotch, picked up something, flew back on the branch, and went through the process over again. The second time he flew down to the corn boxes, he did the same thing, ate 2 or 3 kernels, and then filled his bill full and flew off, this time out of sight. Since then I have often seen him carry his corn off in the same way, giving his head a little toss to throw the kernels back in his bill as he was loading up. Wilson calls attention to the fact that by this habit of carrying off kernels and seeds, the jay becomes an important tree-planting agent. What a good businessman the blue jay would make. All his motions are like the unique loading up performance time, saving, decided, direct. Once during the first morning after his return, he flew down to the boxes from the tree over them, and came so straight he looked as if falling through the air. He pecked at the bark of the trees as indifferently as he had examined the corn the squirrels had nibbled, but I thought he drank with some gusto. He seemed to be catching the raindrops that were running down the sides of the trees and filling the crevices of the bark. After he had flown off and the gray squirrels were comfortably settled at breakfast, he came dashing back around the corner in such a hurry he almost struck the squirrel on the lower corn box. The first thing I saw was a confusion of blue feathers and gray fur, and then a blue jay flying off to the evergreen, and a gray squirrel shaking his tail excitedly and starting from one side of the box to the other, trying to collect his wits. By this time the blue jay had recovered from his surprise, and seeing that it was only a squirrel, hopped about in the spruce as full of business as if the collision had been planned. Not so with the poor squirrel. He sprang up on the highest box, stretching straight up on his hind legs, with 4 paws pressed against his breast and ears erect, his heart beating, his sides and his tail hanging down shamefacedly as he looked anxiously toward the spruce where the blue jay had gone. Gradually the fear on his face changed to a comical look of bewilderment. Could that bird, flying about as if nothing had happened, be what struck him? Or had he gone to sleep over his corn and had a bad dream? He settled down on his haunches with an expression of inane confusion, and finally turned back into his corn box, a sorry contrast to the clear-headed blue jay. This was the first morning the jays came, and we were greatly entertained watching the development of affairs. There were only 3 birds that were regular patrons of the Corn Barrel restaurant, while there were 13 gray squirrels. And when the squirrels got over their first surprise, they seemed to consider the jays an insignificant minority. There were no claw-to-bill tussles, for when a jay was eating on a corn box by the side of the tree, and a squirrel ran down the trunk right above him, and gave a jump that promised to land him on the jay's head, the bird would quietly fly off. But such meekness was no sign of discomfiture. The jays came back as often as they were driven away. If the squirrels objected to their eating on a corner of the box with them, the jays would hop down on the snow and pick up the corn the squirrels had scattered there. They were so persistent, and at the same time so dignified and peaceable, that the squirrels could not hold out against them. And though for a time the birds took advantage of the squirrels' laziness, and got a good breakfast mornings before the sleepy fur coats appeared, 2 or 3 weeks of 10 to 20 below zero silenced the squirrels' last prior claims argument, and the jays were allowed to eat undisturbed from the same boxes with them. But it is not only the squirrels that the blue jays dine with. For one day last winter, the little 3-year-old came running out of the dining room in great excitement, crying, "Oh, Grandpa, come quick! There are 3 partridges, and one of them is a blue jay." Indeed, the other day the blue jays quite took possession of the corn barrels that are the special property of the partridges. The barrels stand under the branches of a Norway spruce on either side of a snowshoe path that runs from the house, and though the jays were self-invited guests, I could not help admiring the picture they made, they flying about and sitting on the barrels, the dark green of the boughs bringing out the handsome blue of their coats. But the spot where I have found the blue jays most at home is in the dense coniferous forest of the Adirondacks. I shall never forget seeing a flock of them on Black Mountain. From the top of the mountain, the wilderness looked like a sea of forest-clad hills, with an occasional reef outlined by surf, for the largest lakes seemed like tracery in the vast expanse of forest. The impressive stillness was broken only by the rare cries of a pair of hawks that circled over the mountain. For the most part they soared, silent as the wilderness below them. Coming down into the forest primeval, where the majestic hemlocks towered straight toward the sky, and their massive knotted roots bound down by the granite boulders that showed on the mountainside, there we found the blue jays in their home. A flock of them lived together, feeding on wild berries and beechnuts, sporting among the ferns and mosses, and drinking from the brook that babbled along near the trail. What a home our handsome birds had chosen! But the memory of the spot is dreary. Unmoved by the beauty of the scene, to which the blue jays gave color and life, unawed by the benedicity of the hemlocks, betraying the trust of the friendly birds, the boy of the party crept into their very home and shot down one after another of the family as they stood resistless before him. Today the pitiful lament of the brave old birds haunts me, for, forgetting to fear for themselves, those that were left flew about in wild distress, and their cries of almost human suffering reached us long after we had left the desecrated spot. End of Blue Jay, from Birds Through an Opera Glass by Florence A. Merriam.
Bullied by Birds by Christopher Morley. Coffee Break Collection 35. Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tom Merritt. Bullied by Birds. Marathon, Pennsylvania, May 2nd. I insist that the place for birds is in the air, or on the bushy tops of trees, or on smooth-shaven lawns. Let them twitter and strut the greens of golf courses and intimidate the tired businessman. Let them peck cinders along the railroad track and keep the trains waiting. But really, they have no right to take possession of a man's house, as they have mine. The nesting season is a time of tyranny and oppression for those who live in Marathon. The birds are upon us like Hindenburg in Belgium. We go about on tiptoe, speaking in whispers, for fear of annoying them. It is all the fault of the Marathon Bird Club, which has offered all sorts of inducements to the fowls of the air to come and live in our suburb, quite forgetting that humble commuters have to live there too. Birds have moved all the way from Wynwood and Ambler and Chestnut Hill to enjoy the congenial air of Marathon and the informing little pamphlets of our club telling them just what to eat and which houses offer the best hospitality. All our dwellings are girt about with little villas made of condensed milk boxes. But the feathery tyrants have grown too pernickety to inhabit these. They come closer still and make our homes their own. They take the grossest liberties. I am fond of birds, but I think the line must be drawn somewhere. The clothesline, for instance. The other day Titania sent me out to put up a new clothesline. I found that a shrike, or a barn swallow, or some other veery, had built a nest in the clothespin basket. That means we won't be able to hang out our laundry in the fresh Monday air, and equally fresh Monday sunshine, until the nesting season is over. Then there is a gross, fat, indiscreet robin that has taken a home in our evergreen, or mimosa, or banyan tree, just under our veranda railing. It is an absurdly exposed, almost indecently exposed position for the confidential family business she intends to carry on. The iceman and the butcher, and the boy who brings up the Sunday ice cream from the apothecary, can't help see those 3 big blue eggs she has laid. But because she has nested there for the last 3 springs, while the house was unoccupied, she thinks she has a perpetual lease on that bush. She hotly resents the iceman, and the butcher, and the apothecary's boy, to say nothing of me. So these worthy merchants have to trail around a circuitous route, violating the neutral ground of a neighbor, in order to reach the house from behind and deliver their wares through the cellar. We none of us dare use the veranda at all for fear of frightening her, and I have given up having the morning paper delivered at the house because she made such shrill protest. Frightening her, do I say? Nay, it is we who are frightened. I go round to the side of the house to prune my benzine bushes or to plant a mess of spinach, and a profane starling or woodpecker bustles off her nest with shrewish outcry and lingers nearby to rail at me. Abashed, I stealthily scuffle back to get a spade out of the tool bin, and again that shrill scream of anger and outraged motherhood. A throstle or a whippoorwill is raising a family in the gutter spout over the back kitchen. I go into the bathroom to shave, and Titania whispers sharply, "You mustn't shave in there. There's a tomtit nesting in the shutter hinge, and the light from your shaving mirror will make the poor little birds cross-eyed when they're hatched." I try to shave in the dining room, and I find a sparrow's nest on the windowsill. Finally, I do my toilette in the coal bin, even though there is a young squeaking bat down there. A bat is half a mouse anyway, so Titania has less compassion for its feelings. Even if that bat grows up bow-legged on account of premature excitement, I have to shave somewhere. We can't play croquet at this time of the year because the lawn must be kept clear for the robins to quarry out worms. The sound of a mallet and ball frightens the worms and sends them underground, and then it's harder for the robins to find them. I suppose we really ought to keep a stringed orchestra playing in the garden to entice the worms to the surface. We have given up frying onions because the mother robins don't like the odor while they're raising a family. I love my toast crust, but Titania takes them away from me for the blackbirds. "Now," she says, "they're raising a family. You must be generous. If my garden doesn't amount to anything this year, the birds will be my alibi." Titania makes me do my gardening in rubber-soled shoes, so as not to disturb the birds when they are going to bed. They begin yelping at 4 a.m. right outside the window and never think of my slumbers. The other evening I put on my planting trousers and was about to sow a specially fine pea I had brought home from town, when Titania made signs from the window. "You simply mustn't wear those trousers around the house in nesting season. Don't you know the birds are very sensitive just now? And we have been paying board for our cat on Long Island for a whole year because the birds wouldn't like his society and plebeian ways. Marathon has come to a pretty pass indeed, when the commuters are to be dispossessed in this way by a lot of birds, orioles and tomtits and yellow-bellied nuthatches. Some of these days a wren will take it into its head to build a nest on the railroad track, and we'll all have to walk to town. Or a chicken hawk will settle in our ice box, and we'll starve to death. As I have said before, I believe in keeping nature in its proper place. Birds belong in trees. I don't go twittering and fluffing about in oaks and chestnuts, perching on the birds' nest steps and getting in their way. And why should some swarthy robin, be she never so matronly, swear at me if I set foot on my own front porch? End of Bullied by Birds by Christopher Morley. A Chapter of Things to Do This Winter by Dallas Lore Sharp. Coffee Break Collection 35. Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Merritt. A Chapter of Things to Do This Winter. 1. You should go skating. Crawling, I ought to say, over a pond of glare ice this winter. Take the pond you are most familiar with. Go early on a bright day before any skater arrives, and lying flat upon the clear black ice, study the bottom of the pond and the fish that swim below you. They have boats with glass bottoms along the California coast, through which to watch the marvelous bottoms offshore. But an eastern pond covered with glare ice is as good, for such ice is a plate glass window into a wonder world. 2. Fight your way one of these winter days to the crest of some high hill and stand up against a northwest gale. Feel the sweep of the winds from across the plain beneath you. Hear them speaking close in your ear as they fly past. Catch them and breathe them until they run red in your leaping veins. Master them and make them, mighty as they are, your own. And something large and free, strong and sound will pass into you. And you will love the great world more, and you will feel how fit a place for the strong of heart is this earth to live on. 3. Keep a careful list of the winter birds you see, and visit every variety of wood meadow and upland in your neighborhood, not neglecting the parks and city trees, for a sight of the rarer winter visitors such as the snowy owl, the snow buntings, and the crossbill. 4. If you know little about the birds, then this is the time to begin your study. When they're so few and scarce? Yes, just because they are few and scarce. On a June morning, unless you are at home in the woods, you will be confused by the medley of songs you hear and the shapes flitting everywhere about you, and you may be tempted to give up your study for the very multitude. Get a pair of good field or opera glasses and a good bird book, such as Hoffman's Guide to the Birds, and go into the fields and woods, leaving the book at home. The first bird you see, follow up until you can remember 1. His size, color, whether he has a white bar on wings or small spots or large clear spots on breast. 2. His chirp, or call. 3. Something peculiar about his flight. A flirt of the tail, a habit of flying down to the ground and getting away. Then come back to your book and identify him from memory. If you cannot, then go out again and again, and it will not be long before either this first one or others will be accurately made out. The beginning of an acquaintance that you can extend in the summer, but which will be plenty large enough for your coming out winter into bird society. For here is a list of the birds you may be able to find during the winter: screech owl, crow, robin, flicker, jay, goldfinch, tree sparrow, English sparrow, song sparrow, junco, golden-crowned kinglet, nuthatch, brown creeper, downy woodpecker, quail, partridge. 5. See to it that no bird in your neighborhood starves for lack of food that you can supply. Tie a piece of suet to a tree or bush near the house, by the window if you can, for the chickadees and blue jays. Keep a place on the lawn cleared of snow and well supplied with crumbs and small seeds for the juncos and the sparrows. Hang a netted bag of cracked nuts out somewhere for the nuthatches, and provide corn and nuts for the squirrels. 6. Go out on a cold December day or a January day and see how many signs of spring, minor prophets, as Mr. Torrey calls them, you can bring home. They will be mostly buds of various sorts. Then, on a warm, soft day, go again to see what you can bring home. Flitting, creeping, crawling things that the warm sun has brought from their winter hidings. 7. Make a map of your sky, showing the positions of the planets, the constellations, and the most brilliant stars, the points in the horizon for the rising and setting of the sun, say in January, noting the changes in places of things since your last map drawn in October. Any school child can do it, and in doing it, learn the few large facts about the sky that most people are pitifully ignorant of. 8. Go out after a fresh, light snow, and take up the trail of a fox or a rabbit or a partridge, as you might take up a problem in arithmetic, or as a detective might take up a clue, and solve it. Where the creature came from, where going, what for, in a hurry or not, pursued or pursuing, etc. It will give you one of the best of lessons in observation, in following a clue, and in learning to take a hint. 9. Go out to study the face of the ground, the ridges, hollows, level places, the ledges, meadows, sandbanks, the course of the streams, the location of the springs, the general shape and contour, the pitch and slant and makeup of the region over which you tramp in the summer. Now, when the leaves are off and things swept bare, you can get a general idea of the lay of the land that will greatly aid you in your more detailed study of plants and birds, of individual things, in the summer. It is like an outline map in your geography. 10. Winter is the time to do much good reading. A tramp over real fields is to be preferred to a tramp in a book, but a good book is pretty nearly as good as anything under the stars. You need both fields and books, and during these cold days, impossible days, some of them, for work afield, you will read. Oh, the good things to read that have been written about the out-of-doors. End of A Chapter of Things to Do This Winter.
Why the Curlew's Bill is Long and Crooked. Indian Why Stories, Sparks from War Eagle's Lodge Fire by Frank B. Linderman. Coffee Break Collection 35, Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. Why the Curlew's bill is long and crooked. When we reached War Eagle's lodge, we stopped near the door, for the old fellow was singing some old sad song of younger days, and keeping time with his tom-tom. Somehow the music made me sad, and not until it had ceased did we enter. "How, how!" he greeted us, with no trace of the sadness in his voice that I detected in his song. "You have come here tonight to learn why the Curlew's bill is so long and crooked. I will tell you, as I promised, but first I must smoke." In silence we waited till the pipe was laid aside. Then War Eagle began. By this time you know that old man was not always wise, even if he did make the world and all that is on it. He often got into trouble, but something always happened to get him out of it. What I shall tell you now will show you that it is not well to try to do things just because others do them. They may be right for others and wrong for us, but old man didn't understand that, you see. One day he saw some mice playing and went near to watch them. It was springtime, and the frost was just coming out of the ground. A big flat rock was sticking out of a bank near a creek, and the sun had melted the frost from the earth around it, loosening it, so that it was about to fall. The chief mouse would sing a song, while all the other mice danced, and then the chief would cry, "Now!" and all the mice would run past the big rock. On the other side, the chief mouse would sing again, and then say, "Now!" Back they would come, right under the dangerous rock. Sometimes little bits of dirt would crumble and fall near the rock, as though warning the mice that the rock was going to fall. But they paid no attention to the warning and kept at their playing. Finally, Old Man said, "Say, Chief Mouse, I want to try that. I want to play that game. I'm a good runner." Well, he wasn't, you know, but he thought he could run. That is often where we make great mistakes, when we try to do things we were not intended to do. "No, no!" cried the Chief Mouse, as Old Man prepared to make the race past the rock. "No, no! You'll shake the ground. You're too heavy, and the rock may fall and kill you. My people are light of foot and fast. We are having a good time. But if you should try to do as we are doing, you might get hurt, and that would spoil our fun." "Oh," said the old man, "stand back. I'll show you what a runner I am." He ran like a grizzly bear and shook the ground with his weight. Pow! Came the great rock on top of Old Man and held him fast in the mud. My, how he screamed and called for aid. All the mice people ran away to find help. It was a long time before the mice people found anybody, but they finally found the coyote and told him what had happened. A coyote didn't like Old Man very much, but he said he would go and see what he could do, and he did. The mice people showed him the way, and when they all reached the spot, there was Old Man, deep in the mud with that big rock on his back. He was angry and was saying things people should not say, for they do no good and make the mind wicked. Coyote said, "Keep still, you big baby. Quit kicking about so. You are splashing mud in my eyes." "How can I see with my eyes full of mud? Tell me that." "I am going to try to help you out of your trouble." He tried, but Old Man insulted Coyote and called him a name that is not good. So the Coyote said, "Well, stay there," and went away. Again Old Man began to call for helpers, and the Curlew, who was flying over, saw the trouble and came down to the ground to help. In those days, Curlew had a short, stubby bill, and he thought that he could break the rock by pecking it. He pecked and pecked away without making any headway, till Old Man grew angry at him, as he did at the coyote. The harder the Curlew worked, the worse Old Man scolded him. Old Man lost his temper altogether, you see, which is a bad thing to do, for we lose our friends with it often. Temper is like a bad dog without a lodge. No friends will come to see us when he is about. Curlew did his best, but finally said, "I'll go and try to find somebody else to help you. I guess I am too small and weak. I shall come back to you." He was standing close to Old Man when he spoke, and Old Man reached out and grabbed the Curlew by the bill. Curlew began to scream, "Oh, oh my, oh my, oh my," as you still hear them in the air when it is morning. Old Man hung on to the bill and finally pulled it out long and slim and bent it downward, as it is today. Then he let go and laughed at the Curlew. "You are a queer-looking bird now. That is a homely bill, but you shall always wear it, and so shall all of your children, as long as there are Curlews in the world." I have forgotten who it was that got Old Man out of his trouble, but it seems to me that it was the bear. Anyhow, he did get out somehow, and lived to make trouble until Manitou grew tired of him. There are good things that Old Man did, and tomorrow night, if you will come early, I will tell you how Old Man made the world over after the water made its war on the land, scaring all the animal people and the bird people. I will also tell you how he made the first man and the first woman, and who they were. But now the grouse is fast asleep. Nobody is stirring but those who were made to see in the dark, like the owl and the wolf. Ho! End of Why the Curlew's Bill is Long and Crooked, by Frank Bird Linderman.
From Wharf to Franklin Field, by Dallas Lore Sharp. Coffee Break Collection 35, Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Merritt. From Wharf to Franklin Field. Over and over, I read the list of saints and martyrs on the wall across the street, thinking dully how men used to suffer for their religion, and how, nowadays, they suffer for their teeth. For I was reclining in a dentist's chair, blinking through the window at the Boston Public Library, seeing nothing, however, nothing but the tiles on the roof, and the names of Luther, Wesley, Wycliffe, graven on the granite wall, while the dentist burrowed inside of my cranium and bored down to my toes for nerves. So at least it seemed. By and by my gaze wandered blankly off to the square patch of sky in sight above the roof. A black cloud was driving past in the wind away up there. Suddenly a white fleck swept into the cloud, careened, spread two wide wings against it, and rounded a circle. Then another and another, until 8 herring gulls were soaring white against the sullen cloud in that little square of sky high over the roofs of Boston. Was this the heart of a vast city? Could I be in a dentist's chair? There was no doubt about the chair, but how quickly the red-green roof of the library became the top of some great cliff. The droning noise of the traffic in the streets, the wash of waves against the rocks. And yonder on the storm-stained sky, those wheeling wings, how like the winds of the ocean, and the raucous voices, how they seem to fill all the city with the sweep and the sound of the sea. Boston, Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco. Do you live in any one of them or in any other city? If you do, then you have a surprisingly good chance to watch the ways of wild things and even to come near to the heart of nature. Not so good a chance, to be sure, as in the country, but the city is by no means so lacking in wildlife or shunned by the face of nature as we commonly believe. All great cities are alike. All of them very different, too, in details. Boston's streets, for instance, being crookeder than most, but like them all, reaching out for many a mile before they turn into country roads and lanes, with borders of quiet and wide green fields. But Boston has the wide waters of the harbor and the Charles River Basin, and it also has Tea Wharf. They did not throw the tea overboard there back in Revolutionary days, as you may be told, but Tea Wharf is famous nevertheless, famous for fish. Fish? Swordfish and red snappers, scup, shad, squid, squeak, sharks, skates, smelts, sculpin, sturgeon, scallops, halibut, haddock, hake, to say nothing of mackerel, cod, and countless freak things caught by trawl and seine all the way from Boston Harbor to the Grand Banks. I have many a time sat on Tea Wharf and caught short, flat flounders with my line. It is almost as good as a trip to the Georges in the We're Here to visit Tea Wharf, and then to walk slowly up through Quincy Market. Surely no single walk in the woods will yield a tithe of the life to be found here, and found only here for us, brought as the fish and game and fruits have been from the ends of the earth and the depths of the sea. There is no reason why city children should not know a great deal about animal life, nor why the teachers in city schools should feel that nature study is impossible for them. For leaving the wharf with its fish and gulls and fleet of schooners, you come up 4 or 5 blocks to Old King's Chapel burying ground, where the Boston sparrows roost. Boston is full of interesting sights, but none more interesting to the bird lover than this sparrow roost. The great bird rocks in the Pacific, described in another chapter of this book, are larger, to be sure, yet hardly more clamorous when, in the dusk, the sparrow clans begin to gather, nor hardly wilder than this city roost when the night lengthens, and the quiet creeps down the alleys and along the empty streets, and the sea winds stop on the corners, and the lamps, like low-hung stars, light up the sleeping birds, till their shadows waver large upon the stark walls about the old graveyard, that break far overhead, as rimrock breaks on the desert sky. Now shift the scene to an early summer morning on Boston Common, 2 blocks farther up, and on the public garden across Charles Street. There are more wild birds to be seen in the garden on a May morning than there are here in the woods of Hingham, and the summer still finds some of them about the shrubs and pond. And it is an easy place in which to watch them. One of our bird students has found over 100 species in the garden. Can anyone say that the city offers a poor chance for nature study? This is the story of every great city park. My friend, Professor Herbert E. Walter, found nearly 150 species of birds in Lincoln Park, Chicago. And have you ever read Mr. Bradford Torrey's delightful essay called Birds on Boston Common? Then there are the squirrels and the trees on the common, the flowers, bees, butterflies, and even the schools of goldfish in the pond of the garden. Enough of life, insect life, plant life, bird life, fish life, for more than a summer of lessons. Nor is that all. 1 block beyond the garden stands the Natural History Museum, crowded with mounted specimens of birds and beasts, reptiles, fishes, and shells beyond number, more than you can study, perhaps. You city folk, instead of having too little, have altogether too much of too many things. But such a museum is always a suggestive place for one who loves the out-of-doors. And the more one knows of nature, the more one gets out of the museum. You can carry there and often answer the questions that come to you in your tramps afield, in your visits to the garden, and in your reading of books. Then add to this the great Agassiz Museum at Harvard University, and the aquarium at South Boston, and the zoological gardens at Franklin Park, and the Arnold Arboretum. All of these, with their multitude of mounted specimens and their living forms, for you. For me also. And in from the country I come very often to study natural history in the city. What is true of Boston is true of every city in some degree. The sun and the moon and stars shine upon the city as upon the country. And during my years of city life, I lived in the very heart of Boston. It was my habit to climb to my roof above the din and glare of the crowded street, and here among the chimney pots, to lie down upon my back, the city far below me, and overhead the blue sky, the Milky Way, the constellations, or the moon, swinging through the heaven's wide pathless way, and oft, as if her head she bowed, stooping through a fleecy cloud. Here, too, I have watched the gulls that sail over the harbor, especially in the winter. From this outlook I have seen the winging geese pass over, and heard the faint calls of other migrating flocks, voices that were all the more mysterious for their falling through the muffling hum that rises from the street and spreads over the wide roof of the city, as a soft night wind over the peaked roofs of a forest of firs. Strangely enough, here on the roof I have watched the only nighthawks that I have ever found in Massachusetts. This is surely the last place you would expect to find such wild, spooky, dusk-loving creatures as nighthawks. Yet here on the tarred and pebbled roofs, here among the whirling, squeaking, smoking chimney pots, here above the crowded, noisy streets, these birds built their nest, laid their eggs rather, for they build no nest, reared their young, and in the long summer twilight rose and fell through the smoky air, uttering their peevish cries and making their ghostly booming sounds with their high diving, just as if they were out over the darkening swales along some gloomy swamp edge. For many weeks I had a big tame spider in the corner of my study there in that city flat. And I have yet to read an account of all the species of spiders to be found dwelling within the walls of any great city. Even Argiope of the meadows is doubtless found in the fens. Not far away from my flat, down near the North Station, one of my friends on the roof of his flat kept several hives of bees. They fed on the flowers of the gardens, on those in dooryards, and on the honey-yielding lindens, which stand here and there throughout the city. Pigeons and sparrows built their nest within sight of my windows, and by going early to the roof, I could see the sunrise. And in the evening I could watch it go down behind the hills of Belmont, as now I watch it from my lookout here on Malone Hill. One is never far from the sky, nor from the earth, nor from the free wild winds, nor from the wilder night that covers city and sea and forest with its quiet, and fills them all with lurking shadows that never shall be tamed. And of From T Wharf to Franklin Field by Dallas Lore Sharp.
The Gay Goshawk. Coffee Break Collection 35, Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. The Gay Goshawk. Lord William sat alone in his grey northern castle. He had come but lately from the sunny south, and the room in which he sat struck chill after the sun-warmed rooms to which he had grown used. Little joy had Lord William in his old grey castle, for his heart was far away in the sunny south. All alone he sat, save for his favourite bird, the grey goshawk, and it, for it loved its master well, blinked a tear from its eye as it peered into Lord William's gloomy face, blinked and peered again, so pale and lean had his master grown. Now what ill has befallen? Thought the bird, and it ruffled its feathers in its distress. Lord William looked up and stroked the glossy plumage of his gay goshawk. "Be still, my bonny bird, be still," said Lord William, "and I will smooth your ruffled wings." The goshawk blinked and peered more close into the tired face of his master. Then he began to speak. "Have you lost your sword or spear in the tournament? Have you lost them in sunny England?" asked the bird. "Or are you pale with grief because your true love is far away?" "By my troth," cried Lord William, "I have lost nor sword nor spear, yet I do mourn for my true love whom I fain would see." "You shall carry a message to her, my gay goshawk, for you can fly over hill and dale. You shall carry a letter to my love, and you shall even bring me an answer," said Lord William, "for you can speak as well as fly, my bonny bird." "But how shall I know your true love?" said the bird. "Never have I seen her face or heard her voice." "Oh, well will you know my true love," cried Lord Williams, "for in all England there lives none so fair as she. The cheeks of my love are red as a red, red rose, and her neck it is whiter than new-fallen snow. Near to her lattice window grows a birch, whose leaves tremble in the breeze. There shall you sit, my gay goshawk, and you shall sing to her as she goes to Holy Church. With 24 maidens will she go, yet well will you know my own true love, for she is the fairest of them all. You shall know her, too, by the gold that bedecks her skirt, by the light that glimmers in her hair." Then Lord William sat down and wrote a letter to his love, and fastened it firm under the pinion of his gay goshawk. Away flew the bird, swift did it fly to do its master's will. O'er hill and dale it winged its flight, until at length it saw the birch tree that grew near the lady's bower. There on the birch tree did the goshawk perch, and there did he sing his song, as the lady with her 24 maidens passed beneath its branches toward the church. The sharp eyes of the goshawk glanced at each beautiful maiden, and quick was he to see Lord William's love. For sweet was she as the flowers that spring in May, Gold was embroidered in her skirt, sunlight glistened in her beautiful yellow hair. When another day dawned, the gay goshawk left the birch tree and alighted on the gate, a little nearer to the lattice window where sat the beautiful lady to whom he had been sent. Here again he sang his song. Loud and clear he sang it first, loud and clear that all might hear. Soft and sweet he sang it after, soft and sweet that only Lord William's lady might catch the note of love. And ever loud or soft, the last words of his song were these, "Your true love cannot come to you here." Then said the lady to her 24 maidens, "Eat, my merry maidens, eat and drink, for the feast is spread. I go but to my lattice window to listen to the birds, for hark, they are singing their evensong." But in her heart the lady knew there was only one song she longed to hear. Wide she opened her lattice window, and leaning out she hearkened to the song of the gay goshawk. I go but to my lattice window to listen to the birds. I go but to my lattice window to listen to the birds. Sing on, ye bonny birds, she cried, sing on, for I know no song could be so sweet that it came not from my own true love. A little nearer flew the gay goshawk, and first his song was merry as a summer morn, then it was sad as an autumn eve. As she listened, tears dropped from the eyes of the beautiful lady. She put out her hand and stroked the pinions of the gay goshawk, and lo, there dropped from beneath his wing Lord William's letter. 5 letters has my master sent you, said the bird, and long has he looked for one from you, yet never has it come, and he was weary with long waiting. But the lady sighed, for no letter had she ever had from her true love. My stepmother has hidden the letters, for never one have I seen, she cried. Her fingers tore the letter open, which had dropped from beneath the bird's wing, and she read, and as she read, she laughed loud. Lord William had written a letter that was full of grief because he could not come to the lady he loved. Yet did the lady laugh, and this is why she laughed both long and glad, because she had made up her mind that as he could not come to her, she herself would go to Lord William. Carry this message to my own true love, said she, then to the gay goshawk. Since you not come to me, I myself will come to you in your cold northern country, and as a token of my love, I send you by your gay goshawk a ring from off my finger, a wreath from off my yellow hair, and lest these should not please you, I send my heart, and more than that you cannot wish. Prepare the wedding feast, invite the guests, and then haste you to meet me at St. Mary's Church, for there, ere long, will you find me. Fly, gay goshawk, fly and carry with you my message to Lord William. And the bird flew o'er hill and dale until once again he reached the grey northern castle in which his master dwelt. And he saw his master's eye glow glad, his pale cheeks glow, as he listened to the message, as he held the tokens of his own true love. Then the lady, left alone, closed her lattice window and went up to her own room, followed by her maidens. Here she began to moan and cry, as though she were in great pain or seized by sudden illness. So ill she seemed that those who watched her feared that she would die. My father, moaned the lady, tell my father that I am ill. Bid him come to me without delay. Up to her room hastened her father, and sorely did he grieve when he saw that his daughter was so ill. Father, dear father, she cried, holding his strong hand in her pale white one, grant me a boon ere I die. And you ask not for the Lord, who lives in the cold north country, my daughter? You may ask for what you will, and it shall be granted. Promise me, then, said his daughter, that though I die here in the sunny south, you will carry me when I am dead to the cold gray north, and at the first church to which we come, tarry, that a mass may be said for my soul. At the second let me rest until the bells be tolled slow and solemn. When you come to the third church, which is named St. Mary's, grant that from thence you will not bear me until the night shades fall. Then her father pledged his word that all should be done as she wished. Now as the father left her room, the lady sent her 24 maidens down to her bower that they might eat and drink. And when she was left alone, she hastened to drink a sleeping draught, which she had already prepared in secret. This draught would make her seem to be one who was dead, and indeed no sooner had she drunk it than she grew pale and still. Her cruel stepmother come up into the room. She did not love the beautiful maiden, and when she saw her lying thus, so white, so cold, she laughed, and said, "We shall soon see if she be really dead." Then she lit a fire in the silent room, and placing some lead in a little goblet, she stirred it over the flames with an iron spoon until it melted. When the lead was melted, the stepmother carried a spoonful carefully to the side of the bed, and stood there looking down upon the still white form. It neither moved nor moaned. "She is not dead," murmured the cruel woman to herself. "She deceives us, that she may be carried away to the land of her own true love. She will not lie silent long," and she let some drops of the burning lead fall onto the heart of the quiet maiden. Yet still the maiden never moved or cried. "Send for her father," shouted the cruel stepmother, going to the door of the little room, for now she believed the maiden was really dead. "Alas, alas!" cried her father, when he came and saw his daughter lying on her white bed, so pale, so cold. "Alas, alas! My child is dead indeed." Then her 7 brothers wept for their beautiful sister, but when they had dried their tears, they rose and went into the forest. There they cut down a tall oak tree and made a bier for the maiden, and they covered the oak with silver. Her 7 sisters wept for their beautiful sister when they saw that she neither stirred nor moaned. They wept, but when they had dried their tears, they arose and sewed a shroud for the maiden, and at each stitch they took, they fastened it to a little silver bell. Now the Duke, her father, had pledged his word that his daughter should be carried, ere she was buried, to St. Mary's Church. Her 7 brothers therefore set out on the long, sad journey toward the gloomy north country, carrying their sister in the silver-mounted bier. She was clad in the shroud her 7 sisters had sewed, and the silver bells tinkled softly at each step her 7 strong brothers took along the road. The stepmother had no tears to shed. Indeed, she had no time to weep, for she must keep strict watch over the dead maiden's 7 sisters, lest they too grow ill and thus escape her father. As for the poor old father, he shut himself up alone to grieve for his dear lost child. When the 7 brothers reached the first church, they remembered their father's promise to their sister. They set down the bier and waited that a mass might be sung for the lady's soul. Then on again they journeyed until before them they saw another church. "Here will we rest until the bell has been tolled," they said, and again the bier was placed in the holy church. "We will come to St. Mary's ere we tarry again," said the 7 brothers, and there they knew that their journey would be over. Yet little did they know in how strange a way it would end. Slow and careful were the brothers' steps as they drew near the church of St. Mary, slow and sad, for there they must part from their beautiful, pale sister. The chime of the silver bells on the still air, dulling the sound of the 7 strong brothers' footsteps. They were close to St. Mary's now, and as they laid the bier down, the brothers started, for out of the shadows crept tall armed men, and in their midst stood Lord William. He had come as he had been bidden to meet his bride. The brothers knew him well, the lord from the cold grey country who had stolen the heart of their beautiful sister. "Stand back," commanded Lord William, and his voice was stern, for not thus had he thought to meet the lady he loved. "Stand back, and let me look once more upon the face of my own true love." Then the 7 brothers, though they had but little good will for their northern lord, lifted the bier and laid it at his feet, that once again he might look upon the face of their pale, cold sister. And lo, as Lord William took the hand, the cold white hand of his true love in his own, it grew warm. As his lips touched hers, they grew rosy, and the color crept into her cheeks. Ere long she lay smiling back at her own true love, with cheeks that bloomed and eyes that shone. The power of the sleeping draught was over. "Give me bread, dear lord," cried the lady, "for no food have I tasted for 3 long days and nights, and this have I done that I might come to you, my own true love." When the lady had eaten, she turned to her 7 strong brothers. "Begone, my 7 bold brothers," she cried. "Begone to your home in the sunny south, and tell how your sister has reached her lord." "Now woe betide you," answered her bold brothers, "for you have left your 7 sisters and your old father at home to weep for you." "Carry my love to my old father," cried the lady, "and to my sisters 7. Bid them that they dry their tears, nor weep for me, for I am come to my own true love." Then the 7 brothers turned away in anger and went back to their home in the south. But Lord William carried his own true love off to the old grey castle where they were married, and the grey goshawk sang their wedding song. End of The Gay Goshawk.
Sally the House Wren by Floyd Bralliar. Coffee Break Collection 35. Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Sally the House Wren. In England there is a little brown bird known as the Jenny Wren, which has a stick-up tail and carries itself in a pert, attractive, and characteristic way. We have a number of wrens in America, all of them about the shape of the Jenny Wren, some of them larger and some smaller, but none of them large birds. In most of our states we may find the long-billed marsh wren among the rushes bordering ponds, lakes, and streams. This bird is shy, and a person has to be keen to see it. It nests among the reeds and feeds on insects and worms. Its color is cinnamon brown with a whitish streak down the back. It is recognized as a wren by its stick-up tail. The short-billed marsh wren also lives in swamps, but it may be easily identified by the lack of a long bill and by the upper parts being streaked all over. The most common wren found over the northern part of the United States, and the one most widely known, is the house wren. I suppose because our forefathers had always known the Jenny Wren at home and noted the similarity of these tame little songsters to it, they called them Jenny Wrens. Even now most people do not know we have no Jenny Wrens. This bird is a delightful songster and very tame. It almost always nests about our houses, and if there is a knot hole in the weatherboarding, it is quite sure to build in the house. I tell the story of Sally the house wren an old friend of my boyhood days, because Sally was such a shrewd, bright, pert little mother, and was so typical of the family that her story will give a good idea of Wrens in general. One day, late in April, I was visiting my old uncle, David Halferty. I liked to visit there, for Uncle Dave was a most interesting storyteller, and Aunt Polly was a master hand at fishing. I thought their house was the most beautiful in all the world, and it was situated in the only spruce grove I ever saw in my childhood days. The spruce had been set out, but those who planted them had been wise enough not to put them in straight rows, so no one would have known that they had not come up themselves. Another interesting thing to me was their well. Our well at home was properly covered with a platform on which was a pump, and when we wanted water we simply pumped it. The same was true of all the neighbors' wells, but Uncle Dave's well was different. It was some 45 feet deep, had a beautiful old well house over it, and the water was drawn with a windlass and 2 buckets. One of the first things that always happened when I reached that place was that I suddenly became thirsty and ran to the well for the novelty of pulling up a great brimming pail of water and watching the other pail go down and sink out of sight in the depths below. Another attraction was that the only hammock I had ever seen was stretched between 2 of these great spruce trees, and a boy was free to play in it as much as he pleased. I went over to Uncle Dave's early one morning in spring. As usual, Uncle Dave took it upon himself to entertain me until dinner by showing me about the place and telling stories. Aunt Polly and I were to go fishing in the afternoon. We had chored about the barn and were on our way back to the house when we were both startled by the rollicking song of a wren. "Well," said Uncle Dave, "I do believe Sally is back. Let's go and see," and he led the way to the well. Uncle Dave leaned over the well and called, "Sally! Sally!" Quick as a wink the bird darted to his side, scolding, twittering, and fussing with all her might. He stood there and smiled until she became quiet, and then called, "Sally!" and the whole thing started over again. It seemed that this little songster knew her name and resented it. It had started in this way. 2 years before, this wren had decided to set up housekeeping in the roof of the well house. Day after day she and her hard-working husband carried sticks by the hundred and piled them in the corner of the well house rafters, and evening after evening Uncle Dave threw them away, for he was equally determined that she should not nest in the well house, lest the sticks and feathers flutter down into the water. Some whim caused him to begin calling her Sally, and scolding her every time she came around the well. Persistent little vixen that she was, in spite of his efforts, she raised 3 broods of young in the very spot where she placed her first sticks. She became so furious at his throwing away her sticks that he could not come near the well without her flying into his face, scolding and pecking like a little demon, although she never bothered any one else. This pleased Uncle Dave so much that he finally surrendered and allowed her to have her way. As the summer wore away and her nest was not disturbed any more, her resentment seemed to settle around the use of the name Sally, and nothing delighted Uncle Dave more than to call Sally and have her fly around his head and scold. Sally, like all of her tribe, was a tireless worker. When nesting time came, she seemed to carry sticks for the pure pleasure of it. She would fill holes that would hold a peck or more with sticks without paying the least attention to the order in which they were placed, even though she finally built her nest in a different place entirely. There were many Osage orange (bois d'arc) hedges in the country, and Sally gathered the thorny twigs that had been trimmed from these hedges the previous year. These sticks were never less than 6 inches long, and often she would carry pieces 8 or 10 inches long. Her nest was usually constructed almost entirely of these thorny sticks, and was 8 or 10 inches in diameter and 4 or 5 inches deep. When this huge pile of sticks was in shape, she carried straws, dry grass, and hairs, and built rather a large nest of these inside of the stick nest. She finished with a lining of feathers gathered from the poultry yard. The nest was so built that the sticks covered the top as well as the bottom, leaving only a small hole for entering. Sally nested in this well house for 7 years, and there were few available spots in it where she had not piled sticks some time or other, though in the end the old nest was usually repaired and used again. I became so interested in her that I determined to have some wrens of my own. So I found 2 or 3 bleaching horse heads, which I put in trees in various parts of the yard, and every year a pair of wrens nested in each of these skulls. The hole where the spinal cord had entered the head was used as an entrance, and the nest was built where the brain had been. An interesting thing about these nests was that the birds would spend 3 or 4 days piling sticks here and there until they became satisfied that they had done their duty. Then they carried just enough hairs and feathers into the skull to make a snug, warm nest without attempting to take any sticks in at all. I never could understand why they should carry to such places a lot of sticks which they could never use. Sally also looked upon the kitchen garden as her special domain, and made it a business to attack on sight any other bird that dared enter its sacred precincts. This garden was a full 100 yards from her nest, but experience taught there might be luscious cabbage worms on every head of cabbage or bunch of lettuce in that garden, and from dark till daylight there were seldom 15 minutes she was not to be seen searching those plants for worms. Sally usually laid 7 eggs at a clutch, though one time I found 9 in a nest. As the eggs almost always hatch, it is no wonder that Sally and her husband had to visit the cabbage patch frequently. They became so tame that they went about their household duties without paying the least attention, even though I was standing within 10 feet. The hammock was not 20 feet from the well, and it was interesting to lie there and count the worms carried to the nest in an hour, and to learn what kinds they were. Sally fed her young 3 or 4 different species of measuring worm, caterpillars, at least 2 varieties of cutworms, an occasional grasshopper, and perhaps a few other small insects, but her main reliance was on cabbage worms. 5 times out of 6 she would bring a green one to her young. A fair estimate of the number of worms carried to the nest, based on counts made a large number of times, was a little more than 1 worm every 3 minutes. Often they would average a worm a minute for an hour or 2. Usually the babies in the second brood received more food than those in the first, not because the old birds were more fond of them, but because food was more abundant at that time. When we think of those birds feeding their young ones worms every 3 minutes for hours every day, over a period of at least 3 weeks, we can get some idea how beneficial they were to the garden. This means that for every brood of baby wrens raised near a garden, thousands of worms are destroyed, to say nothing of what the old birds themselves eat. We never had to pay any attention to cabbage worms in our garden, for I had places in the yard where at least 5 pairs of wrens nested every season. I have said little about Sally's husband, but he was an important member of the family. He was a jovial, gallant husband, proud of his family and jealous for their safety. He did the singing, but he nevertheless did a fair share of the work. When his mate began sitting, he sang more than ever. Perched on a branch near the nest, he fairly laid himself out to excel all other wrens in the vicinity. Should another wren sing too well, he would attack him at once, and a battle royal was sure to follow. When he had succeeded in chasing his fancied rival away, he came back with a more exalting song than before, but he never became so busy with singing and fighting that he failed to slip away every little while and catch a worm for his wife. The wren does not usually come north until danger of frost is past, but when he does come no bird is more full of song. Some claim that the male comes first and begins nest building within a few days. Others claim that they come together. I have known wrens to begin building the day they arrived. When the brood leave the nest, they follow the parents through the bushes and garden, seldom more than a few feet behind. For once the father is silent, seeming to realize that their safety depends on their moving unseen until the young are better able to fly. It is interesting to see how eager the young birds are to catch their first worm. At first the parents catch the worms and give them to the youngster that is nearest. Within a day or 2 the parent finds the worm, but leaves it for the youngster to catch. Within a week or 2 the young birds have completed their education and are left to shift for themselves. Then the parents returned to the nest to rear a new brood. Sally's plucky temper, coupled with the inborn hatred for the race of cats, finally brought about her undoing. She felt it was her duty to chase all dogs and cats out of the neighborhood of her nest. Usually wrens are content with scolding and complaining whenever a dog or cat comes near, but Sally came to the point where she did not hesitate to fly straight into the face of a cat or dog, and usually the astonished beast would run. One day she became too bold and reckless. Her last brood had been flying only a day or two and were not very sure of their wings. Doubtless she was unusually anxious to drive away the old cat that came to sit on the front doorstep. She chased it around the house, but that did not satisfy her. Finally, the outraged cat stopped, crouched, and as Sally swooped, struck her with his paw, and before anyone could interfere, she was no more. End of Sally the House Wren by Floyd Bralliar.
How to Attract the Birds by Frank F. Payne. Coffee Break Collection 35. Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Elsie Selwyn. How to Attract the Birds. After much discussion, careful observation, and tabulation, in which the number of noxious insects destroyed each day by birds, and found in their crops and stomachs has actually been counted, the public has come to the realization of the fact that not only do the birds add enormously to the wealth of a nation, but that man could not live upon this earth without them. In the more enlightened countries, laws have been passed for their protection, and it is the duty of the public not only to do what they can to further this object, but to endeavor to attract the birds. In Canada, owing to the clearing of the forests over large areas, the birds are left without nesting holes, always found in decayed trees. Consequently, the most useful insectivorous birds are now found chiefly in or near such forests as remain. In order to induce them to return to the open country, it is absolutely necessary to provide artificial nesting holes or boxes, and it has been found that many of these birds will readily take to nesting boxes. It is, of course, the duty of the state to provide boxes, and doubtless before long it will be considered as much a part of the work of agricultural departments as instructing the farmer regarding the value of draining, or the best grain to grow. In the vicinity of our cities and towns, where quantities of fruit and vegetables are grown, and insectivorous birds are so much needed, the conditions for nesting holes are even worse, as all dead trees are cut down. In addition to the economic value of birds is the great pleasure they add to the life of mankind. And if we would keep them about us, this can be done by a small expenditure in nesting boxes, for it has been found over and over again that the birds do not despise even the humblest cottage in the center of a large city, if so provided. In order to further attract the birds to our parks and gardens, clean water for bathing and drinking should be provided, and this may be done with shallow trays sunk in the ground and sloping so that the water is quite shallow at the upper end. Seed trays will help enormously, and quite open hanging baskets fitted with bath, drinking, and seed trays are sometimes provided. Suet, meat, fat, and sunflower seeds will attract many birds and induce them to stay. As the destruction by cats is very great, lovers of birds should discourage the keeping of cats as pets, and all stray cats should be destroyed. Material for nests, such as wool and soft clay scattered about, will also help to attract the birds. There are so-called bird houses of many shapes and sizes, but perhaps the most common and least fitting to its surroundings is that fashioned like a human dwelling on the top of a pole. These, of course, will attract the birds if nothing better is provided, but they are expensive, and it is our object to suggest, if possible, the most natural and least expensive boxes, which also may be made by an amateur carpenter. These should be made to last so that the same birds may return to them each spring. The floor should give plenty of room for the nest. Joints should be tight in order to prevent drafts or the entrance of rain. Entrance holes should be countersunk or slope upwards so that wet may not enter. There should be a small hole through the floor of the house to drain off any water which may enter. Entrance holes should be quite small, so that, as far as possible, sparrows may be prevented from taking possession. Painted boxes are not advised, but if paint is used, it should be of a dull color. The more rustic-looking the box, the more it will attract the birds. As birds return to the same hole in a tree year after year, from which they will remove portions of the nest, and as in Canada the cold of winter destroys most insect pests found in nests, cleaning is not so necessary as elsewhere. Clean boxes, however, will doubtless be preferred, and sides or tops may be hinged or made movable so that this may be done. If the box tips forward a little, this will help to keep out rain, and it should never lean backward. The roof should slant and should overhang enough to keep rain clear and also keep the sun from shining on the young. As the roof is liable to warp, it is a good plan to have one or more cross pieces of wood strongly nailed to prevent this. If nesting boxes are placed on poles instead of on trees, a metal guard can be attached lower down to prevent cats from climbing to the nests. Perches attached to nesting boxes are quite unnecessary, and if placed near the entrance hole will encourage sparrows. The most natural and durable boxes used almost entirely in Europe and largely in the United States are made of a section of a branch or tree. These are about 6 inches in diameter and from 1 to 2 feet in length, with the bark on. These pieces of timber are hollowed out by machinery with an expanding cutter, but they could be made by splitting a straight-grained block and gouging out the hole in both halves, and then joining them with screws. The size of the box and the height of the entrance hole above the floor will depend upon the birds for which the box is intended, as shown in the table below. Flickers, woodpeckers, bluebirds, chickadees, and several other birds prefer these boxes to any other, and as they can usually be purchased for 50 cents or less, they are much in favor. Of compartment nesting boxes, such as would be occupied by the purple martin, we would recommend one in the form of an inverted cone resting in a rough framework erected on a pole. Smaller boxes, for bluebirds, wrens, etc., can be made cheaply in all shapes and sizes, either of bark or waste slabs covered with bark. A very effective box is made of half or the whole circle of bark taken from a limb or trunk of a tree and roofed with bark or other material. Mr. E.H. Forbush, in his circular issued by the State Board of Agriculture for Massachusetts, from which we have also taken most of our illustrations, makes the following suggestions for making of these boxes. An incision is made on the side intended for the back of the box, through both outer and inner bark, from the top to the bottom of each section. Then, on the opposite side, some 2 or 3 inches from the top, there is bored through the bark with an auger or extension bit a hole of the size desired for the entrance. If such tools are not at hand, the aperture may be cut with gouge, a chisel, or even a knife. Next, a wedge-shaped stick is inserted into the incision at the back and under the inner bark to start it off, and with this implement it is peeled very carefully. In peeling birch, one should be careful not to separate the inner and outer layers of the bark. Caution should be used when working about knots or rough places. The bark will make the sides of the box, and the 2 sections, each an inch thick, sawed from the ends of the barked log, will make the top and bottom. Now, the bark is tacked to the bottom and top. The bark will draw apart somewhat at the back in drying, but this aperture may be covered when the box is put up by nailing or screwing a short stick or pole over the opening on the back, which stick in turn may be nailed or screwed to the supporting tree, building, or pole. To make the roof watertight, a piece of cotton cloth, duck, or denim may be put on, tacked down over the edge, and painted, or a piece of roofing paper may be used. Excellent boxes can also be made with boards, but if possible, the wood should be covered with bark. If this is not possible, however, it should be stained and not painted. Other nesting boxes easily made are shown in Figures 6, 8, and 9, the former having the reputation of being cat-proof and the latter being preferred by owls. For robins, swallows, and phoebes, a box or shelf should be provided, having the front end and top or all sides open, where 2 sides are given. These should be erected under a veranda or eave. A nesting box can be made with a tomato can by fixing in the open end a round piece of wood with a hole in it. Such boxes are very cheap, but they will not be accepted where there are other nesting holes to be found. There are many nesting boxes exposed for sale, and doubtless many will be accepted by the birds. But in order to have any degree of success, they must be made correctly, in accordance with long experience. In the Canadian Society for the Protection of Birds, Toronto will be pleased to offer suggestions to either those who propose to purchase or construct boxes themselves. The table of nesting box dimensions below was issued by the Department of Agriculture at Washington, and it is recommended for boxes used in Canada. Dimensions of nesting boxes. Species: bluebird. Floor of cavity, 5 by 5 inches. Depth of cavity, 8 inches. Entrance above floor, 6 inches. Diameter of entrance, 1.5 inches. Height above ground, 5 to 10 feet. Robin. Floor of cavity, 6 by 8 inches. Depth of cavity, 8 inches. Entrance above floor, 1 or more sides open. Height above ground, 6 to 15 feet. Chickadee. Floor of cavity, 4 inches by 4 inches. Depth of cavity, 8 to 10 inches. Entrance above floor, 8 inches. Diameter of entrance, 1 1/8 inches. Height above ground, 6 to 15 feet. White-breasted nuthatch. Floor of cavity, 4 by 4 inches. Depth of cavity, 8 to 10 inches. Entrance above floor, 8 inches. Diameter of entrance, 1 3/4 inches. Height above ground, 12 to 20 feet. House wren. Floor of cavity, 4 inches by 4 inches. Depth of cavity, 6 to 8 inches. Entrance above floor, 1 to 6 inches. Diameter of entrance, 7/8 inches. Height above ground, 6 to 10 feet. Barn swallow. Floor of cavity, 6 inches by 6 inches. Depth of cavity, 6 inches. Entrance above floor, 1 or more sides open. Height above ground, 8 to 12 feet. Martin. Floor of cavity, 6 inches by 6 inches. Depth of cavity, 6 inches. Entrance above floor, 1 inch. Diameter of entrance, 2.5 inches. Height above ground, 15 to 20 feet. Song sparrow. Floor of cavity, 6 inches by 6 inches. Depth of cavity, 6 inches. Entrance above floor, all sides open. Height above ground, 1 to 3 feet. Phoebe. Floor of cavity, 6 inches by 6 inches. Depth of cavity, 6 inches. Entrance above floor, 1 or more sides open. Height above ground, 8 to 12 feet. Crested flycatcher. Floor of cavity, 6 inches by 6 inches. Depth of cavity, 8 to 10 inches. Entrance above floor, 8 inches. Diameter of entrance, 2 inches. Height above ground, 8 to 20 feet. Red-headed woodpecker. Floor of cavity, 6 inches by 6 inches. Depth of cavity, 12 to 15 inches. Entrance above floor, 12 inches. Diameter of entrance, 2 inches. Height above ground, 12 to 20 feet. Screech owl. Floor of cavity, 8 inches by 8 inches. Depth of cavity, 12 to 15 inches. Entrance above floor, 12 inches. Diameter of entrance, 3 inches. Height above ground, 10 to 30 feet. Barn owl. Floor of cavity, 10 by 18 inches. Depth of cavity, 15 to 18 inches. Entrance above floor, 4 inches. Diameter of entrance, 6 inches. Height above ground, 12 to 18 feet. Flicker. Floor of cavity, 7 inches by 7 inches. Depth of cavity, 16 inches to 18 inches. Entrance above floor, 16 inches. Diameter of entrance, 2.5 inches. Height above ground, 6 to 20 feet. Hairy woodpecker. Floor of cavity, 6 inches by 6 inches. Depth of cavity, 12 to 15 inches. Entrance above floor, 12 inches. Diameter of entrance, 1.5 inches. Height above ground, 12 to 20 feet. Downy woodpecker. Floor of cavity, 4 inches by 4 inches. Depth of cavity, 8 to 10 inches. Entrance above floor, 8 inches. Diameter of entrance, 1 1/4 inches. Height above ground, 6 to 20 feet. The Secretary, Canadian Society for the Protection of Birds, McLean Building, 149 University Avenue, Toronto, Canada. End of How to Attract the Birds by Frank F. Payne. Read by Elsie Selwyn.
The City of the Longlegs by T. Gilbert Pearson. Coffee Break Collection 35. Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. The City of the Longlegs. On the banks of a certain river in the south, a few miles from its mouth, lies a large rice plantation with its broad fields extending along the bottom lands. Half a mile from the river is a bluff, which at some remote date may have served as the bank of a much larger stream. There on the high ground, surrounded by magnificent live oaks, stands the large house of the planter. Behind the mansion is a garden, and behind the garden are more rice fields, while beyond these stretch away for miles unbroken forests of pine and cypress. One summer while visiting here, I noticed about the rice fields numerous large birds wading in the shallow water. All seemed stilted on long, slender legs. Occasionally one would thrust out its snake-like neck and strike at something in the water with its sharp bill. Evidently they were feeding on the small fish which were so abundant here. 3 species of birds could be seen. One of these slender waders, which stood about 20 inches high, was of a dark slaty blue in color. This was the little blue heron. Another variety of similar size and form had wings and neck marked with varying shades of brown, gray, and white, while its entire underparts were yellowish white. This was the Louisiana heron, the bird which on account of its rare beauty and elegance of movement is sometimes called Lady of the Waters. The largest of all the birds were nearly 4 feet tall. These, the people of the plantation declared, were blue cranes, but they were in reality great blue herons. Now and then one of the birds would rise from the feeding grounds, fold its long neck, stretch its legs out behind, and come flying in from the river high overhead, making straight for the forest. Sometimes one would come from the opposite direction and drop down into the rice fields. It seemed odd that so many should be coming and going in the same manner. Upon inquiring the cause, my host explained that back in the woods there was a place where each year the birds congregated in great numbers to build their nests and rear their offspring. These you see flying over, he continued, are old ones carrying food to their young. One day he took me to visit this annual gathering place of the herons. On the rear side of the plantation is a pond formed by a stream which was dammed to furnish water for flooding the rice fields. It extends for a mile or more into the woods. At the upper end it divides into 3 branches, which like long arms reach back into the wilderness for a considerable distance. At the far end of one of these arms the herons had their city. In a growth of young cypress trees covering an area of not more than an acre, their nests were built. As we approached, the birds could be seen in numbers flying from place to place. Many were resting on the branches of the trees, while others were feeding their young. 2 inquisitive fellows, sentinels possibly, came out for a better view of us and our boat, but soon flew hurriedly back, squawking loudly as they went. Their sounds of alarm could not have attracted much notice amid all the squeak-squawking of those hundreds of noisy tenants and their young, for the colony as a whole took no heed of our arrival. Only those nearest us, as we passed, took fright. The nests of the little blue and Louisiana herons were simply slight platforms of dead twigs placed loosely together in the crotches of the cypress limbs from 4 to 8 feet above the water. Usually they were not over 8 or 10 inches across, and often were so frail that the 4 or 5 blue eggs they contained could be counted through the structure from beneath. So closely do the nests and eggs of these birds resemble that it was only by hiding and watching until the owners came that we were able to distinguish between them. In many cases the eggs had hatched. The young blues, covered with white down, were very pretty creatures. When grown their feathers are white, and not until the summer of the second year does the coat of blue appear. In some cases the young are said never to acquire the blue covering, but go on through life as white birds. The young Louisianas resembled their parents in color, only, of course, they wore suits of soft down instead of feathers. In some tall trees at one side of the heronry, the great blue herons had built their large platforms of nests on the horizontal limbs high in air, and their great babies in a dozen or more places were seen standing gazing silently off through the forest as though absorbed in thought. So large and fine looking are the great blues that my friend called them the kings of the city. The splendid plumes of their heads and backs, together with their dignity of bearing, surely bore out the comparison. In one place 2 pairs of quite different herons, together with their nests, were found. They were nearly as tall as the great blues, but the special feature of their appearance was their coverings of beautiful snowy feathers. These birds were American egrets. Long white plumes growing on their backs and extending far beyond their tails also added to their attractiveness. I like to think of these graceful creatures as the queens of that city. Wishing to get a peep into the private life of the heronry, we concealed our boat among the low trees and screened our bodies with long gray moss and cypress boughs. Scarcely were we hidden when the herons began to return to their homes. While we were watching, a crow flew up and alighted near a nest containing eggs. After a wicked glance around, he thrust his beak into an egg, and, flying with it but a short distance, perched and deliberately began to eat its contents. Finishing his egg, the rascal wiped his bill on the limb, looked about for a minute or two, and then came back for another one. The distressed heron, whose nest was being plundered, squawked a timid resentment and moved away as the intruder approached. That day we saw 5 or 6 crows thus engaged in pilfering the homes of the defenseless herons. It was mealtime with each brood of longlegs whenever a parent arrived from the rice fields. The curious manner in which the young were fed was one of the most interesting things we witnessed. An old bird, upon coming home, would alight on the edge of the nest, or on a limb close at hand. With a peculiar pumping motion of its throat, it seemed to bring the food up its long neck and hold it in its mouth ready for the little ones to feed upon. One at a time they would reach up and thrust their bills into the open mouth of their parent to receive their portion. The diet of the baby herons must have consisted largely of small fish, for when we attempted to row our boat among the tree trunks beneath the nests, they disgorged large quantities of partially digested minnows, possibly in their efforts to drive us away, or perhaps because of their great uneasiness. In fitful streams these descended upon us, falling in the boat, in our laps, in our pockets, or down our necks. Our journey through the city of the Longlegs was fraught with much anxiety and watchfulness, as well as peril to the appearance of our garments. There were over 1,000 occupied nests in this place. Probably there are other enemies to the eggs and young birds besides crows. In one nest we saw a large water snake lying coiled about an egg, quietly enjoying a sun bath. We were unable to learn, however, whether snakes eat the eggs of the heron. The eyes and snout of an alligator were seen protruding from the water in a little open place among the tree trunks. Possibly this monster lived here and was ever ready to snap up any unfortunate nestling which might fall from its platform of twigs. The feathers of herons are much sought for decorating women's bonnets. Whole colonies of nesting birds are sometimes destroyed for this purpose. It is to be hoped that no plume hunter will find this heronry, and for this reason I refrain from mentioning its location. There are many such cities of longlegs in the South, although their number is becoming less each year on account of the onslaughts of the plume hunter. End of The City of the Longlegs by T. Gilbert Pearson.
Minnie's Owl by Grace Greenwood. Coffee Break Collection 35. Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elsie Selwyn. Once, when I was in England, I visited some friends who lived in a pleasant part of the country. They had a fine old house filled with all sorts of beautiful things, but nothing indoors was so delightful as the wide green lawn with its smooth, soft turf, and the garden with its laburnums and lilies and violets and hosts on hosts of roses. There was a pretty silvery fountain playing among the flowers, so close to a little bower of honeysuckles that the butterflies fluttering about them had to be very careful, or the first they knew, they got their wings soaked through and through with spray. About the house and grounds were all kinds of beautiful pets, greyhounds and spaniels and lapdogs and rare white kittens, gay parrots and silver pheasants and sweet singing canaries. But here, in this pleasantest spot, right under the honeysuckle bower, all alone by himself, in a large green cage, sat an ugly gray owl. He was the crossest, surliest old fellow I ever saw in all my life. I tried very hard to make friends with him, but it was of no use. He never treated me with decent civility, and one day, when I was offering him a bit of cake, he caught my finger and bit it till it bled. And I said to Mrs. M., "What do you keep that cross old creature for?" I noticed that my friend looked sad when she answered me and said, "We only keep him for our dear little Minnie's sake. He was her pet." Now, I had never heard of her little Minnie, so I asked about her and was told this story. Minnie was a sweet, gentle little girl who loved everybody and every creature that God had made, and everybody and every creature she met loved her. Rough people were gentle to her, and cross people were kindly. She could go straight up to vicious horses and fierce dogs and spiteful cats, and they would become quiet and mild directly. I don't think that anything could resist her loving ways, unless it were a mad bull or a setting hen. One night, as Minnie lay awake in her bed, in the nursery, listening to a summer rain, she heard a strange fluttering and scratching in the chimney, and she called to her nurse and said, "Biddy, what is that funny noise up there?" Biddy listened a moment and said, "Sure, it's nothing but a stray rook. Now he's gone away, so go to sleep, would ye, me darling?" Minnie tried to go to sleep, like a good girl, but after a while she heard that sound again, and presently something came fluttering and scratching right down into the grate and out into the room. Minnie called again to Biddy, but Biddy was tired and sleepy and wouldn't wake up. It was so dark that Minnie could see nothing, and she felt a little strange. But she was no coward, and as the bird seemed very quiet, she went to sleep again after a while, and dreamed that great flocks of rooks were flying over her, slowly, slowly, and making the darkness with their jet-black wings. She woke very early in the morning, and the first thing she saw was a great gray owl perched on the bedpost at her feet, staring at her with his big round eyes. He did not fly off when she started up in bed, but only ruffled up his feathers and said, "Hoo!" Minnie had never seen an owl before, but she was not afraid, and she answered merrily, "You'd better say who. Why, who are you yourself, you queer old wonder-eyes?" Then she woke Biddy, who was dreadfully frightened, and called up the butler, who caught the owl and put him in a cage. This strange bird was always rather ill-natured and gruff to everybody but Minnie. He seemed to take kindly to her from the first. So he was called Minnie's pet, and nobody disputed her right to him. He would take food from her little hand and never peck her. He would perch on her shoulder and let her take him on an airing round the garden. And sometimes he would sit and watch her studying her lessons and look as wise and solemn as a learned professor, till he would fall to winking and blinking and go off into a sound sleep. Minnie grew really fond of this pet, grave and unsocial as he was, but she always called him by the funny name she had given him first, Old Wonder Eyes. In the winter time little Minnie was taken ill, and she grew worse and worse, till her friends all knew that she was going to leave them very soon. Darling little Minnie was not sorry to die. As she had loved everybody and every creature that God had made, she could not help loving God, and she was not afraid to go to him when he called her. The day before she died, she gave all her pets to her brothers and sisters, but she said to her mother, "You take good care of poor old Wonder Eyes, for he'll have nobody to love him when I'm gone." The owl missed Minnie very much. Whenever he heard anyone coming, he would cry, "Ooh!" And when he found it wasn't his friend, he would ruffle up his feathers and look as though he felt himself insulted. He grew crosser and crosser every day, till there would have been no bearing with him had it not have been for the dear memory of Minnie. The next time I saw the old owl sitting glaring and hoo-hooing on his perch, I understood why he was so unhappy and so sullen. My heart ached for him, but so did the finger he had bitten, and I did not venture very near to tell him how sorry I was for him in his lonely sadness. When I think of him now, I don't blame him for his crossness, and always say to myself, "Poor old Wonder Eyes." End of Minnie's Owl by Grace Greenwood. Recording by Elsie Selwyn. The Night Songster by Burton L. Collins. Coffee Break Collection 35. Birds. Read by Elsie Selwyn. The Night Songster. Lover of twilight, gloom, and solitude, that singest when no other note is heard, thinkest thou the song of any other bird, compared with thine, is musicless and rude? I seek thee as the night gloom deepens round, blending the trees in one dark, somber mass. Perhaps I may by thee unknowing pass, for thou hast ceased to utter any sound. I halt beneath a widespread Titan tree, the autumn glows of ages 'neath my feet. My footfalls dulled, no sound thine ear dost greet, for why then shouldst thy voice so silent be? Keen-sensed hermit of these lonely woods, thou hast discerned me with thy watchful eyes. I see thy wings, bat-like, flit 'cross the skies, seeking some depth where denser darkness broods. I hear thy song repeated o'er and o'er, from distant covert where secretly hid, and not mistaken thinkest thou art rid of dread intruder seeking sylvan lore. Inquisitive rude man, thou seemest to say, measureless scorn I feel is in thy tone. Too proud art thou to plead, "Leave me alone." So from thy haunts I hasten swift away. End of The Night Songster by Burton L. Collins. Read by Elsie Selwyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
The Robin by Witter Bynner. Coffee Break Collection 35. Birds. Recording by Paula Messina. The Robin. Except within poetic pale, I have not found a nightingale, nor hearkened in a dusky vale to song and silence blending. No stock dove have I ever heard, nor listened to a cuckoo bird, nor seen a lark ascending. But I have felt a pulse-beat start because a robin, spending the utmost of his simple art, some of his pleasure to impart, while twilight came descending, has found an answer in my heart, a sudden comprehending. End of the Robin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
The Sparrow by Ivan Turgenev. Coffee Break Collection 35. Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tom Merritt. The Sparrow. I was returning from hunting, and walking along an avenue of the garden, my dog running in front of me. Suddenly he took shorter steps and began to steal along as though tracking game. I looked along the avenue and saw a young sparrow with yellow about its beak and down on its head. It had fallen out of the nest. The wind was violently shaking the birch trees in the avenue, and sat unable to move, helplessly flapping its half-grown wings. My dog was slowly approaching it, when suddenly, darting from a tree close by, an old, dark-throated sparrow fell like a stone right before his nose, and all ruffled up, terrified, with despairing and pitiful cheeps, it flung itself twice towards the open jaws of shining teeth. It sprang to save. It cast itself before its nestling, but all its tiny body was shaking with terror. Its note was harsh and strange. Swooning with fear, it offered itself up. What a huge monster must the dog have seemed to it! And yet it could not stay on its high branch out of danger. A force stronger than its will flung it down. My tracer stood still, drew back. Clearly he too recognized this force. I hastened to call off the disconcerted dog, and went away, full of reverence. Yes, do not laugh. I felt reverence for that tiny heroic bird, for its impulse of love. Love, I thought, is stronger than death, or the fear of death. Only by it, by love, life holds together and advances. April 1878. End of The Sparrow by Ivan Turgenev.
The Crow, from Birds Through an Opera Glass by Florence Merriam Bailey. Coffee Break Collection 35, Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Malone, Sartell, Minnesota. The Crow. The despised crow is one of our most interesting birds. His call is like the smell of the brown furrows in spring. Life is more sound and wholesome for it. Though the crow has no song, what a variety of notes and tones he can boast. In vocabulary, he is a very Shakespeare among birds. Listening to a family of Frenchmen, though you do not know a word of French, you easily guess the temper and drift of their talk. And so it is in listening to crows. Tone, inflection, gesture, all betray their secrets. One morning last October I caught, in this way, a spicy chapter in crow family discipline. I was standing in a meadow of rich aftermath lying between a stony pasture and a small piece of woods, when a young crow flew over my head, cawing softly to himself. He flew straight west toward the pasture for several seconds, and then, as if an idea had come to him, turned his head and neck around in the intelligent crow fashion, circled back to the woods, lit, and cawed vociferously to 3 other crows till they came over across the pasture. After making them all circle over my head, perhaps merely as a blind, he took them back to his perch, where he wanted them to go beech nutting or something else. Whatever it was, they evidently scorned his childishness, for they flew back to their tree across the field as fast as they had come. This put him in a pet, and he would not budge, but sat there sputtering like a spoiled child. To everything he said, whether in a complaining or teasing tone, the same gruff paternal caw came back from the pasture. "Come along," it seemed to say. To this the refractory son would respond, "I won't." They kept it up for several minutes, but at last paternal authority conquered, and the big boy, making a wide detour, flew slowly and reluctantly back to his family. He lit on a low branch under them, and when the father gave a gruff, "I should think it was time you came," he defiantly shook his tail and cleaned his bill. After a few moments he condescended to make a low, half sullen, half subdued remark, but when the family all started off again, he sat and scolded some time before he would follow them, and I suspect he compromised matters then only because he did not want to be left behind. The intelligence of the crow has become a platitude. But when we hear of his cracking clams by dropping them on a fence, coming to roost with the hens in cold weather, and in the case of a tame crow opening the door by lighting on the latch, his originality is a surprise. A family near here had much merriment over the gambols of a pet crow named Jim. Whenever he saw the gardener passing to and fro between the house and garden, he would fly down from the trees, light on his hat, and ride back and forth. He liked to pick the bright blossoms, particularly pansies and scarlet geraniums, and would not only steal bright colored worsteds and ribbons, but tear all the yellow covers from any novels he came across. When anyone went to the vegetable garden, he showed the most commendable eagerness to help with the work, being anxious to pick whatever was wanted, from raspberries and currants to the little cucumbers gathered for pickling. The sight of the big black puppy waddling along, wagging high in air a long black tail incongruously finished off with a tipping of white hairs, was too much for Jim's sobriety. Down he would dive, give a nip at the hairs, and be gravely seated on a branch just out of reach by the time Bruno had turned to snap at him. Let the puppy move on a step, and down the mischief would come again, and so the two would play sometimes for more than half an hour at a time. Then again the joke would take a more practical turn, for instead of flying overhead when Bruno looked back, Jim would steal the bone the puppy had been gnawing. The crow was happy as long as any one would play with him, and never tired of flying low over the ground with a string dangling from his bill for the children to run after. Another favorite play was to hold on to a string or small stick with his bill while someone lifted him up by it, as a baby is tossed by its arms. He would even hold on and let you swing him around your head. He was never daunted, and when the toddling 2-year-old would get too rough in her play and strike at him with her stick, he would either catch the hem of her pinafore and hold on till she ran away, or would try scaring her, rushing at her, his big black wings spread out, and his bill wide open. One day his pluck was thoroughly tested. Hearing loud caws of distress coming from the lawn, the gardener rushed across and found Jim lying on his back, his claw tightly gripping the end of one of the wings of a large hawk that, surprised and terrified by this turn of the tables, was struggling frantically to get away. Jim held him as tight as a vice, and only loosened his grasp to give his enemy into the gardener's hands. After letting go, he submitted to the victor's reward, letting his wounds be examined and his bravery extolled, while he was carried about, wearing a most consciously heroic air, it must be confessed, for due celebration of the victory. End of The Crow from Birds Through an Opera Glass by Florence Merriam Bailey. Recording by Cynthia Malone, Sartell, Minnesota.
The Two Doves and Other Tales by Anonymous. Coffee Break Collection 35, Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. The Two Doves, the Ant Houses. The Two Doves. I will now tell you a story about two good little children, Marion and Henry, who lived some time ago in Switzerland. Marion was 7 years old, and her little brother Henry was about 5. They were the hope and delight of their mamma, who loved them with the most tender affection. These good children had always lived together, and so much pleasure did they take in each other's society that being together seemed their greatest happiness. Marion could not be happy an instant away from her brother. Henry was never more pleased than when with his sister. Whether walking in the fields or at play in their little room, at meal times or at study, they always acted together, and this was partly the reason why they agreed so well. You would see Marion's large doll beside Henry's little soldier, and Henry's wooden horse close by the doll's cradle. On the same chair would be lined together the doll's cap and the soldier's hat, a tiny parasol, and a little sword. So we may be quite sure that whatever belonged to one was used to amuse the other, and that the hearts of Marion and Henry lived in unison. One day a friend of their mamma sent them a present of a pair of doves, beautifully white, except their necks were encircled with a black ring. Henry and Marion could not make enough of these doves. They were so tame that they would perch on the children's heads, or on their shoulders, or their arms. They would peck food from their hands, and sometimes even take it from their mouth. "Ah, you pretty bird," said Marion, "nothing has ever pleased me so much." "They are always together as we are. They love one another so much," said Henry. "We will do as they do, Henry. We will always be together." "Always, dear sister," and the children embraced each other, while the doves fluttered upon their shoulders, seeming to feel as happy as the children were. The birds were taken great care of in their little house, and became more and more beautiful. Their feathers were white as snow, and they strutted up and down, seeming to be quite proud of their habitation. They enjoyed their liberty very often, for Marion and Henry would open the door of their little house, and they would come out to be petted by the children, and would seem thankful for the good fortune that had placed them in such good hands. But their love to these birds gave rise to a little jealousy between Henry and Marion. They would talk about whose turn it was to open the door, and then about the right to feed them or give them fresh water. Marion would say laughingly that they loved her brother more than herself. Henry would contradict that and say that he was sure they liked his sister better. This little jealous feeling, as is often the case with much older people, turned out to be the cause of much unhappiness to these little ones. They became desirous that each dove should have a separate house for itself. They made this wish known to their good mamma, who, without opposing or approving their scheme, had 2 cages placed in Marion's room, and one day she went with her brother to decide which bird each should have. So they agreed that the door should be set open in the usual way, and that the bird which perched first on Marian's head or arm should belong to her, and the other to Henry. This was soon done, and Marian's dove was shut up in one cage and Henry's dove in the other. The poor birds soon became sad and still. Their beautiful white feathers turned to a dull yellow. They ceased to flap their wings, and their cooing was no more heard. The best of wheat and beans and the clearest water were given to them in abundance, but all were of no use. The doves could not endure being separate from each other. Each would sit on the highest perch in its house and long for the company of the other. Or sometimes they would wear themselves with trying to get through the bars, and when quite tired out, each would return to its solitary perch. Henry and Marian were very much afflicted at all this, and told their distress to their dear mother, who, under pretense that they might give more attention to the birds, proposed that each should have one in a separate room and remain alone with it. The first day seemed rather long to the children, but those who watched them and delighted in seeing them together were desirous of giving them experience, and so they remained a second day. Now this day was to both more dreary than the first, and on the third day they found it quite unbearable. "No play," said Henry. "Oh, this is very wearisome. I would give all my playthings to be a little while with my sister." "Well, how can I," said Marian, "live without my brother? Without him there is no play. I cannot be happy away from him. Without him I care for nothing. Everything is tedious. I cannot bear it any longer." The truth is, they could not be happy away from each other, so they entreated their mamma to allow them to be together again, as it was impossible for them to live separately. "So it is," said their mother, "with your young doves. They came from the same nest. They have been nourished and fed together. They are accustomed to live with one another, and they feel it, as you yourselves do, a painful thing to be parted, and soon will die of grief." At these words both the children started and ran and released the prisoners. Out flew the doves, rejoicing in their liberty, and caressed each other with their beaks. They seemed by their cooing to thank those who had released them. They soon became as healthy as before, and their feathers also became as white as ever. Marian and Henry resolved never to separate them again, but to attend them as they did at first, and the 2 cages were taken away. "My dear children," said their good mother to them, pressing them to her bosom, "you have now learned that the ties of relationship bind faster than chains. They give the greatest joy to our hearts. They are our greatest happiness. May you long love one another and be happy. Forget not that in the palace or in the humble cottage, in the busy world or the more retired life, the tongue speaks nothing more pleasing than the ear hears, nothing more sweet than the endearing names brother and sister. Even with the oldest people it gives joy to remember when they lisped those words." End of The 2 Doves. The ant houses. Robert gave his cousin Richard for a birthday present a nightingale in a beautiful green cage, and told him to feed it with mealworms and ants' eggs. The miller or the baker would supply him with the mealworms, but the ants' eggs he would be pretty sure to find in his father's garden. He would have only to put a flower pot or a little wooden tub in some dry sunny place, and the ants would find their way under the hedge and lay their eggs there. for they are always careful to put them where the rain cannot come. Richard bought some mealworms, but they cost almost all his pocket money, and he must set about finding the ants' eggs, which would cost him nothing. So he did as Robert had told him, and to his great delight he found when he took up the flower pot on the next day that a whole colony of ants had crept under it, for the earth was thrown up into little heaps, and looked fine as if it had been sifted. Some little ants were trotting about quickly as if they were trying to find out what had happened to make it so suddenly light. Richard took a stick and stirred the earth a little and found a great many little long white eggs lying about. He stretched out his hand to put the eggs into a little cup which he had brought with him, when, to his great amazement, the little ants caught up the eggs in their mouths and ran away with them. When Richard saw the kind motherly care of the ants, the tears came into his eyes, and he said, "No, I cannot be so cruel as to trouble all these little creatures just to make one happy. And my little nightingale would like so much better to sing in the cool green trees than in his close prison of a cage. I will go and let him fly where he pleases." He did so, and oh, how soon the nightingale darted off to the grove nearby, where his song was heard for many a long summer's evening after, and how joyful, too, Richard's heart felt. End of The Two Doves and Other Tales by Anonymous. Mrs. Dorking and the Unlucky Number. Coffee Break Collection 35, Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. Mrs. Dorking and the Unlucky Number. "I wonder what they're for, and why there are 13 of them," said Mrs. Dorking. As she said this, she looked down at a lot of nice eggs which someone had placed in her nest. Mrs. Dorking, you must know, was a hen, and a young one, too. Indeed, it seemed only a day or so since folks had been calling her a chicken, and so she could not be expected to know all the things that married folks know. 13, she said again. "The very idea of anyone putting 13 eggs in my nest! We all know that is an unlucky number, and—" But just then Mrs. Cohen came in and heard what Mrs. Dorking was saying. Now Mrs. Cohen was an older hen and had been married a year or two, so she knew all about housekeeping. "The eggs are for you," she said. "You sit on them and keep them warm as you can, and by a cute little chicken will come out of every egg. And as for the number 13, you must know that with eggs, for hatching, it's different from other things, and 13 is the luckiest number of all. Take my word for it, Mrs. Dorking, and never set on an even number of eggs, such as 10 or 12, but make it either 11 or 13, and you will surely have pretty healthy children." So Mrs. Dorking sat down on the eggs and made them as warm as ever she could. But after a few days she became tired and fretful. "It is no fun," she said, "to be shut up by yourself for weeks in a gloomy room. I'd much rather be out scraping worms." "Yes," said Mrs. Cohen, "but in this world everyone has to do things one doesn't like to do. There are Mr. and Mrs. Robin, for instance, who work so hard building their nest that they simply fall asleep over their supper every night. But they do it all the same, or else they'd have no home for their children when they come. You hatch out those eggs like a sensible hen, and in a few weeks' time you'll be glad you've done it. So Mrs. Dorking settled down once more, feeling very rebellious, if the truth be told. But one day a curious thing occurred. Suddenly there was a funny little tapping sound that seemed to come from down below, and looking down she saw that one of the eggs had a crack right across it. "Good gracious!" she exclaimed. "I've actually broken one of them in spite of all my care." Then suddenly an idea occurred to her. Oh, she exclaimed excitedly. "I wonder if perhaps they're hatching?" And in response there came another tap-tapping. And after that the tapping went on at intervals, and then beep, beep went a tiny little voice, and then beep, beep went another. She looked down. "Yes, it is. It really is a chicken," she exclaimed, trembling with excitement. And though she wanted to go out at once and tell Mrs. Cohen, she snuggled down all the closer so as to keep the eggs just as warm as ever she could. And soon there were 6 little fluffy heads poking out from underneath her wings. "Peep, peep, please help us go out," they cried. But she stayed on her nest till the 13 chicks were hatched. The first day she appeared with her little family in the farmyard, you should have heard the nice things which the other farmyard folks said about them. It made Mrs. Dorking proud, and repaid her for all her waiting. "Well, I declare," she said joyfully to Mrs. Cohen, "that number 13 is lucky after all." End of Mrs. Dorking and the Unlucky Number.
Wings by Anna Cogswell Tyler, from 24 Unusual Stories for Boys and Girls, arranged and retold. Coffee Break Collection 35, Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wings by Anna Cogswell Tyler, read by Quartertone. A peasant girl was feeding geese, and she wept. The farmer's daughter came by and asked, "What are you blubbering about?" "I haven't got any wings," cried the peasant girl. "Oh, I wish I could grow some wings." "You stupid," said the farmer's daughter. "Of course you haven't got wings. What do you want wings for?" "I want to fly up into the sky and sing my little songs up there," answered the little peasant girl. Then the farmer's daughter was angry and said again, "You stupid! How can you ever expect to grow wings? Your father's only a farm laborer. They might grow on me, but not on you." When the farmer's daughter had said that, she went away to the well, sprinkled some water on her shoulders, and stood out among the vegetables in the garden, waiting for her wings to sprout. She really believed the sun would bring them out quite soon. But in a little while a merchant's daughter came along the road and called out to the girl who was trying to grow wings in the garden. "What are you doing standing out there, red-face?" "I am growing wings," said the farmer's daughter. "I want to fly." Then the merchant's daughter laughed loudly and cried out, "You stupid farm girl! If you had wings, they would only be a weight on your back." The merchant's daughter thought she knew who was most likely to grow wings, and when she went back to the town where she lived, she bought some olive oil and rubbed it on her shoulders, and went out into the garden and waited for her wings to grow. By and by, a young lady of the court came along and said to her, "What are you doing out there, my child?" When the tradesmith's daughter said that she was growing wings, the young lady's face flushed and she looked quite vexed. "That's not for you to do," she said. "It is only real ladies who can grow wings." And she went on home, and when she got indoors, she filled a tub with milk and bathed herself in it, and then went into her garden and stood in the sun and waited for her wings to come out. Presently a princess passed by the garden, and when she saw the young lady standing there, she sent a servant to inquire what she was doing. The servant came back and told her that as the young lady had wanted to be able to fly, she had bathed herself in milk and was waiting for her wings to grow. The princess laughed scornfully and exclaimed, "What a foolish girl! She's giving herself trouble for nothing. No one who is not a princess can ever grow wings." The princess turned the matter over in her mind, and when she arrived at her father's palace, she went into her chamber, anointed herself with sweet-smelling perfumes, and then went down into the palace garden to wait for her wings to come. Very soon all the young girls in the country round about went out into their gardens and stood among the vegetables so that they might get wings. The fairy of the wings heard about this strange happening, and she flew down to earth, and, looking at the waiting girls, she said, "If I give you all wings and let you all go flying into the sky, who will want to stay at home to cook the porridge and look after the children? I had better give wings only to one of you, namely, to her who wanted them first of all." So wings grew from the little peasant girl's shoulders, and she was able to fly up into the sky and sing. End of Wings by Anna Cogswell Tyler.